How the Soviet Union, and by extension all countries influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution from China, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, Angola, Mozambique, Yemen, etc., have betrayed not only socialism but embraced capitalism in the most perverted form. A study by a anarchist think tank, Center for a Stateless Society, written by Kevin Carson, the Undeclared Condominium, the USSR as Punter in a Conservative World Order. Although the right has typically framed the Soviet Union and international communism as an aggressive and subversive revolutionary force, the reality is, at the very least, considerably more nuanced. In fact, it would be more accurate to describe the USSR's relation with the West over most of its history as collusive. He had facilitated capitalist states, repression, and revolutionary forces far more than has backed such forces. The Soviet Union foreign policy certainly went through a heavy phase of anticipation and international revolution by the years immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution. But following the failure of these revolutionary impulse, with the Spartakists in Germany, similar to Maximalists in Vienna, and the Soviet regime in Bavaria, and the Bela Kun in Hungary in 1990, and the catastrophic alliance of the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang in 1927, which in fact had its own, even though it was a fascist party, had a left-wing faction, the Left Kuomintang, although still maintained very anti-capitalist sentiments. The same thing with Nazi Germany, who had a quote-unquote left-wing faction called the Stratovist faction, having a more anti-capitalist, more social democratic approach. And the same thing happened to other similar groups, like the Italian Fascist Party, where the National Syndicalists, who took heavy inspiration from socialist and anarchist thinking without actually embracing them. They were always the first to be eliminated in these fascist movements. His relation to the outside world took a considerable different character. This partly owing to Stalin's combined caution and authoritarianism, and partly to the situation the USSR gave the stabilization of Bolshevik rule and failure of revolution abroad. The exact apportionment of causation is debatable, and indeed has been extensively debated. In the case of the role of the Soviet Union, global affair was contrary to anti-communist ideological characterization, comparatively conservative. In functional terms, the USSR acted more to constrain foreign revolutionary powers subject to its control than to aid them, and in the process helped to promote domestic stability in Western countries. This was true of the Soviet Union's relationship with the multipolar world from the late 1920s until World War II, and even more true of its antipolar relationship with the United States for the wartime alliance of the 1940s through its political suicide in 1991. In the period immediately after World War II, in particular, America and Britain needed and got Stalin cooperation to restore capitalism in Western Europe. Remember, Stalin wanted to be the fourth Axis ally, joining forces with the fascists. But Hitler's scream anti-communism and dominance for world governance prevented this alliance to happen. For the reasons of length, I would choose not to include a considerable amount of material that would have been relevant to a broader understanding of the bipolar dynamic. In particular, I focus on the post-World War II role of the United States to neglect the history of decolonization and subsequent neocolonial policies by other Western countries, the extreme violence by Great Britain, Kenya, and the Congo by Belgium during the decolonization process, the extractive trade relationship between France and its former West African colonies, and the way European countries of colonial regime the essentialization of sectarian and tribal differences to rule through officials like India's Saminanders and by elevating them to positions far beyond their judicial authority, affected their post-independence viability, would have aided a great deal to this study. In the International Civil War between 1917 to 1927, according to Eric Hobsbawm, the Russian Revolution in the decades after 1917 cast a shadow over the world comparable to cast over 19th century Europe by the French. It greatly exceeded the influence of French Revolution, intersects Marxist-Leninism, and to be more specific, Stalinism and later Maoism, was by far the most formidable organization for revolutionary movement in modern history. In this period, the ideological politics can best be understood as a secular struggle by the forces of the old guard against social revolution, politically embodied in, allied with, or dependent on the fortunes of the Soviet Union and international communism. Arnold Mayer described in great detail the way Bolshevism has threatened to spread home over heads of the parties assembled at the Paris peace talks in 1918 and 19. In the events of the armistice was created just in time to limit the political consequence of military defeat in Central and East Central Europe to less than revolutionary proportions. But even with this 11-hour finish of the legacy of disruption and convulsion was far more negligible. Granted, neither Germany nor Austria went Spartacus, and Hungary remained Bolshevik for only 133 days. But the fact remains that there were great disorders, rebellions, and strikes throughout the theater of Europe, normally because politicians and labor leaders had ready-made organizational weapons which to capitalize on political instability, unemployment, shoe shortages, and runaway prices. Throughout the final days of the war and the negotiation in Paris, the Western Allies were haunted by the specters of Bolshevism in Central Europe. There was a real fear that the Spartakists would achieve control in Germany and revolutionary socialists would come to power in Vienna, Bohemia, and Budapest. In Western Allies' approach concerned could take the revolution east of the Rhine tend to take precedence over the settlement of diplomatic scores. Despite serious differences in national interests between the Allies, the Paris Peace Conference made a host of decisions, all of which in varying degrees were designed to check Bolshevism. The victors made territorial concessions to Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, while helping to stem the revolutionary tide beyond their own borders. They gave military assistance and economic aid to these and other borderlands as well as to the Whites for their armed assault of the Soviet Union and Hungary. They stepped up their direct military intervention in Russia. They rigorously enforced the blockade against Bolshevik Russia and Hungary, and they rushed economic assistance to Austria and successor states to help to stabilize their governments. And they drafted the charter of the International Labour Organization, or the ILO, and the League of Nations with a view to immunizing the non-Bolshevik left against the ideological bacillus of the Bolshevik Revolution. Some of these measures constitute defense containment policy, a cordon sanitaire calculated to prevent the revolution from spreading beyond Bolshevik controlled areas. Other measures were aimed at the outright overthrow of Lenin and Belgium, but all alike were decided, orchestrated, sanctioned, or condoned by the peacemakers in Paris. At the time, the outcome of this first round of international civil war of the 20th century seemed to be very much in balance. Lloyd George was typical of the Allied mindset of the period of panic after Bela Kun's accession to power. His greatest fear was that Germany might yet fail to Spartacus and ally itself with Soviet Russia, which case the outcome would be Spartacism for the Euros to the Rhine. And from the perspective of Western leaders, the fear was reasonable. Workers' and soldiers' councils in the first months of 1990 appeared throughout German cities as well as in Budapest and Vienna, although the strength of the Spartakists and other maximalist or pro-Bolshevik parties in them was at best uneven. Spartacism continued to smolder in Germany even after the violent suppression of the Council Republic in Berlin by the Third Corps, and in the meantime, Soviet regimes appeared in Hungary and Bavaria, and for a time appeared imminent in Austria. The Bolshevik managed served as a useful domestic function as well as justifying the repression not only of domestic radicalism and dissidence of all kinds, but of even liberal reformism. There are numerous indicators that the clamor for permanent peace was stirred up as part of a political design. Except for the proto-fascist New Right, the leaders, parties, and pressure groups, and patriotic leads and newspapers that sparked this agitation also favored rigorously conservative or outright reactionary social and economic policy. In fact, the forces, in order to appear to have taken advantage of the intoxication of victory, either to preserve or advance their class interests and status, positioned under an ideological cover which was syncretism of jingoist, nationalist, bellefu, anti-Wilsonian, and rabid anti-Bolshevism. However, was not a super patriot, was denounced as a fellow traveler of the Bolsheviks, and stood accused not only of disloyalty, but also of advocating a sellout peace. The revolutionary segment of socialist and labor movements were not the primary target of the jingoist calm anti-Bolshevik campaign. It was just to rout and disconcert the very core of the forces of change. To do so now, preemptive, before the vast growing left had chance to rally around Wilson and to make political gains from the high cost of living, raising taxes, and the strain of reconversion. In addition, championship of Wilsonian pace, this non-communist left, was battling for the 48-hour work week, collective bargaining, graduate income taxes, and social welfare measures that avowed principles of self-determination embodied quite inconsistent in the provision of the Versailles Treaty if they were relying on the Allies' unsuccessful proxy war against Soviet Russia through Kolkash and Denikin, and their successful one against the coup regime through Romania and the Slovaks. Meanwhile, The exigencies of the International Civil War served to legitimate authority on the Bolshevik side as well. Relatively soon after the October Revolution, the Revolutionary Growth Crusade was combined with an increased attempt to subdue world revolutionary forces, particularly at the left outside of Russia, under Bolshevik control through the Third or Communist International. This made a certain kind of sense. Hofstadter argued only on the assumption that the revolutionary wave was forthcoming in the West and the international left was to be disciplined as a vanguard force under Soviet leadership, despite the fact that in the Russian Revolution itself, they never practiced vanguardism or democratic centralism at all, despite the rhetoric. It was in 1920 that the Bolsheviks committed themselves to what is retrospectively seen a major error, permanent division of international labor movement. They did so by structuring their new international communist movement on the pattern of Leninist vanguard party of an elite of full-time professional revolutionaries. The October Revolution had won wide sympathies into the international socialist movement, virtually all of which emerged from the World War, both radicalized and enormously strengthened. With rare exceptions, the socialists and Labour parties contained large bodies of opinion they favored joining the new Third or Communist International, which the Bolsheviks found to replace the Second International. Discredited and broken by the World War, they have failed to resist. Indeed, several such as the Socialist Party of France, Italy, Austria, and Norway, and the Independent Socialists of Germany actually voted to do so, leaving the unreconstructed opponents of Bolshevism in minority. Yet, what Lenin and the Bolsheviks wanted was not an international movement of socialist sympathizers with the October Revolution, but a course of utterly committed and disciplined activists, a sort of global striking force for revolutionary conquest. Parties unwilling to adopt the Leninist structure were refused to admit it to or expelled from New International, which could only be weakened by accepting such thick columns of opportunism and reformism. Not to mention that Marx has once called parliamentary criticism. The argument made sense on only one condition, that the world revolution was still in progress and its better work in imminent prospect. Yet while the European situation was far from stabilized, it was clear in 1920 that Bolshevik revolution was not an agenda in the West, though it was clear that Russia, the Bolsheviks, were permanently established. The Bolsheviks still retained a hope for revolutionary success in Asia until the failure of the Kuomintang and CCP alliance and Jiang Shenshin's suppression of the communists. Yet even before this proved that even the East was now yet ripe for October, the promise of Asia do not conceal the failures of the revolution of the West. By 1921, this was undeniable. The revolution was in retreat in Soviet Russia. Full political Bolshevik power was unassailable. It was off the agenda in the West. The Third Congress of Committee recognized this without quite admitting that by calling the United Front with every socialist from the second after expelled from the army of revolutionary progress. Just what this meant was to divide the revolutionaries with the next generation. However, in any case, it was too late. The movement was permanently split. The majority of the left socialists, individuals, and parties drift back into social democratic movements, overwhelmingly led by anti-communist moderates. The new communist parties remain minority in European left, and Germany, with a few exceptions such as Germany, France, or Finland, rather small if impassionate minority. Their situation was not changed until the 1930s. In fact, like I mentioned earlier, many cases where fascists and the Marxists joined forces. For example, I already mentioned about left-wing factions within fascist parties. Like fascist Italy, you have the national syndicalist groups who were still anti-communist but had more of a social democratic leaning to it, heavily influenced by socialist and anarchist thinkers without actually subscribing to anarchism because they still believe in hierarchy, which is the complete opposite of anarchism. But there, it is what it is. Before Mussolini persecuted them once he took power. The same thing to Nazi Germany when there was the Straterist reaction and the original paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party was heavily involved with the Straterist faction, who were more anti-capitalist, socialistic, more like social democratic leaning group, and they were the first to be eliminated by Hitler in the Night of the Long Knives. And the same thing with China with the Kuomintang, where you had the Kuomintang left, who were persecuted by the Shanghai massacre by the longest reigning fascist ruler in history, Chiang Kai-shek. At the same thing, Joseph Stalin wanted to be the fourth Axis power, joining the forces with the Axis, but Hitler's racism prevented from happening. And like similar things has happened before like that. So it's like it is what it is, I guess. For example, in the early years of the Nazi Party, many cases of the German communists and Nazis were joined forces to do walkouts against the parliament, for example. Or They joined forces to eliminate the anarchists, like what happened in Korea, and what happened in Spain, and what happened in Ukraine, and what happened in many other places similar to this. So there's that. So that's the best I could say. It was also becoming increasingly evident by 1990 with the suppression of the Spartakists of the Bavarian Soviet government in Germany, the failure of the Council uprising in Vienna, and the later collapse of the Belarusian regime in Hungary. The Soviet Russia would have to function as a nation state within international state system dominated by capitalist power. The defeat of the British general strike in 1926 and Xi'an's massacre of Chinese Communist Party in 1927 made it completely clear. Yet the years of upheaval left behind not only a single huge but backward country now governed by communists and committed to the building of an alternative system of capitalism, but also a government of disciplined international movement and perhaps equally important, a generation of revolutionaries committed to the vision of the world revolution under the flag raised in October and under the leadership of the movement, which inevitably had its headquarters in Moscow. The movement may now have no quite how the world revolution was to advance after stabilizing Europe and defeating Asia, after the communists' scattered attempts and independent armed insurrections were disasters. The normalization of Russia and the trial of conservatism between 1927 to 1941 may characterize the relation between the Soviet Russia and West was an international civil war. Was technically accurate through the 1920s or so. It was generally international civil war with the goal of world revolution on one side and counter-revolution on the other side. It will it will down with a series of events, including the consolidation of Soviet power and defeat of the White armies, and the failure of revolutionary projects, and more or less ended the recognition of the USSR as a member of the Westphalian nation-state system. From the 1920s on, there was a continuing political and ideological competition between the capitalist West and the Soviet regime, but it was kind of controlled competition that prevailed in oligopoly markets, which the relationship as cultivated and mutually supported as a competitive. Gabriel Kolko argued there was an internal division of the international socialist movement before and during the war that left a vacuum for Lenin to fill, and the resulting deep split in the movement between communists and social democrats was the cause of socialist failure in the war period. Politically, the fact that the French and German and Italian socialist parties were all suffering from grave internal contradictions produced a historic vacuum that was to prove fatal to world socialism, because the socialist parties and unions provide insufficient, if any, leadership to anti-war sentiment within their nations. They produce a vital vacuum in Europe and world socialism that Lenin and the Soviet Communist Party easily filled. There was no consistency or coherence in Lenin's miraculous concept of nation of the party and the road to power, much less the form of socialist society. And in this domain, he was no less a pure opportunist than a social democrat, tailoring his position to the potential of the moment in order to grasp power. But Lenin was virtually the only European socialist leader who unequivocally damned the war and the imperialist claims of all nations. It was the purity of this opposition alone that attracted a sufficient core of adherents to allow the permanent historic schism to emerge within the world socialist movement and to preordain its political importance on immovable countries for at least 2 decades. Russia's relation with the left in Western countries was at best ambivalent during much of the interwar period, at times one of the outright abandonment, enemy, or betrayal. Postwar's remark on the impurity of the Comintern switched into rhetorical mode of ultra-revolutionaries and sectarian leftism between 1928 and 1934, considered that in practice the movement neither expected nor prepared for taking power anywhere. The change which provides political calamities is to be explained by the internal politics of the Soviet Communist Party as Stalin looked control of it, and perhaps also attempt to compensate for the increasingly evident divergence between the interests of the USSR as a state which inevitably had coexist with other states, which began to win international recognition as a regime from 1920, and the movement whose aim was to subvert and overthrow all other governments. In the end, the state interests of the Soviet Union prevailed over the world revolutionary interests in Communist International, which Stalin reduced to an instrument of Soviet state policy under strict control of the Soviet Communist Party, purging, dissolving, and reforming its competence at will. World revolutions belong to the rhetoric of the past, and indeed any revolution was tolerated only if it did not conflict with the Soviet state interests and could be brought under direct Soviet control. This latter fact in particular became even more evident in the last days of World War II and the early post-war period, as Stalin not only that they used the Eastern European communist regime as a naked extension of Soviet power, but discouraged independent communist efforts, even though which proved successful, as in Yugoslavia and in China. The influence not only of the Soviet sample, but the communist activists that inspired the other countries meant that the old left was largely dominated by Marxist-Leninism. So in the generation after 1917, Bolshevism saw all other social revolutionary traditions or pushed them on the margins of radical movements before 1914 anarchism and been far more the driving ideology of revolutionary activists than Marxists over the large parts of the world. Marx outside Eastern Europe was seen rather as a guru of mass parties whose inedible but not explosive advance to victory he had demonstrated. By 1930s, anarchists had ceased to exist as a significant political force outside Spain. And even then, it was crushed by the combined might of the communists, socialists, fascists, and nationalists, the combined external support from Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Italian fascists who crushed the anarchists. Even in Latin America, where the black and red had traditionally inspired more militants than the red flag, even in Spain, the Civil War was to destroy anarchism, which made the fortunes of communists here are relatively insignificant. In short, to be social revolutionary increased meant to be a follower of Lenin in the October Revolution, and increasingly a member or supporter of some Moscow aligned Communist Party, although more so when after the triumph of Hitler in Germany, these parties adopted the policy of anti-fascist union, which allowed them to emerge from sectarian isolation and to win mass support among both workers and intellectuals. The young who thirsted to overthrow capitalists became orthodox communists and identified their cause with the Moscow Center International Movement. The irony, Hobsbawm noted, is that the virtual complete takeover of the social revolutionary tradition came at a time when the Soviet Union had plainly abandoned its revolutionary optimism of 1917 to 1923. From 1935 onwards, the literature of the critical left was filled with the accusation of Moscow's movements missed, rejected, and they betrayed the opportunities for revolution because Moscow did not want it anymore. The commentary strategy not only hobbled the political influence of foreign communist parties, but also counterproductive and to facilitate Hitler's rise to power. So far from the initiation of another round of social revolution, the Communist International expects the depression reduced the international communist movement outside the USSR to a state of unprecedented feebleness. This was immediately due to some measure to the suicidal policy of the Comintern, which not only grossly underestimated the dangers of National Socialism in Germany, but pursued a policy of sectarian isolation that seemed quite incredible in retrospect. By 80 its main enemy was the organized mass labor movement of Social Democrats, a labor party described as social fascist. In Europe of 1934, only the French Communist Party still had a genuine political presence. This went so far in 1933 Moscow that the Italian communist leader P. Togliatti withdraw the suggestion that perhaps social democracy was not the primary danger, at least in Italy, but that Hitler had actually come to power. The cover did not change his line until 1934. In France, the Communist Party only reluctantly joined other forces of the left against the right-wing power grab, and did so in violation of Comintern policy. In February 1934, the far right called demonstration against the deadliest left-of-center government, planned to invade the Chamber of Deputies and enforce right-wing government by force. A night of vicious fighting followed as demonstrators and police shot at one another with a total of 15 deaths and 1,435 wounded. The leader resigned the next day, fearing he could no longer keep order, and right of center radical replaced him. The far right has shown it had the strength to unmask a government by force, and France seemed to be set allowed the path of Italy and Germany. At first, French communists gave little indication that any effort to abandon the strategy of sectarian isolation, and the German communists had pursued leading up to Hitler's seizure of power. The French left had previously seen as incapable of responding as the left elsewhere. The communists repeated the third period nonsense of the Socialist Party were social fascists. But at the last minute, when they responded to CGT, or the Confederation General du Travail, called for a general strike with demonstration of their own, but separate from other organizations. Surprisingly, as CGT and the Communist Party demonstrated too close together, people began chanting the same anti-fascist slogan, melting into a single demonstration. The success of the general strike at the United Demonstration halted the right's advances. A former agreement between communists and socialists led to gains from both in election and expenses of the radicals. Then the Communist Party went even further in its policy shift. It called for a pact, not just for the socialists, but for the radical party as well, on the ground that although it was a bourgeois party, it stood for preserving the republic. However, the mood in the streets and workplace was much more impressive than the socialist radical government. After all, two parties had held enough seats in parliament to have formed such a government at any point in the previous 4 years. A series of huge left-wing demonstrations culminated in a 600,000 strong commemoration of the Paris Commune, an anarchist society. Biggest wave of strike France has ever known was beginning, and even before Blanc's government took office. The employers who had been willing to look favorably in the advances of the far right only 2 years before were now desperate for Blanc to settle the strike, even if it meant making an enormous concessions of the workers. Among many workers, there was feeling they wanted more than just wage increase, a shorter working week, and holidays. They wanted somehow to change society in its entirety. At this point, the Communist Party returned to its characteristic form, refusing to exploit the momentum on the left and instead seeking a reformist deal with the bourgeois parties. The strike continued until June 11, when the Communist Party intervened with the speeches by its leader, Maurice Torres. He claimed the sense to seize power. Now is out the question. It only did do so was to return, and it's necessary to know how to end a strike, he said. Deers was right that conditions were not yet right for workers to take power, any more than right in February or even July 1917. But there was such a communist who had put into effort the slogan they had virtually raised until only 2 years before, for the creation of Soviets, structures of workers' delegates, which would oversee and challenge the power of the state and big businesses. However, Torres did not even mention this, although the mood of workers would ensure a favorable reception for such a call. The reason particularly came from outside of France. While the Commodore ceased to denounce social democrats as social fascists and had to become encouraged units at the United Front against fascism, Stalin still looked at a conservative approach of pursuing broad unity with the bourgeois liberal parties, even to the extent of forcing communists to renounce radical opportunities. The abandonment of the absurd third period policy had depended on the change in communist thinking in Moscow, as had the adoption of the policy of Popular Front alliance with the bourgeois pro-capitalist parties. Stalin wanted foreign policy ally to cement a defense pact with the USSR signed by the right of center level government in 1935. Communist support for a liberal capitalist government seemed to make such an alliance easier. The commentator accordingly argued that it was only a practical way of blocking the path of fascism. The same approach by Stalin and the Comintern suppressed radicalism on the left in order to make common cause with liberal capitalist forces was repeated in Spain and arguably led Franco to victory. Chris Hammer, whose impressions of Stalinism we should keep in mind are no doubt colored by the fact that he was not merely a Trotskyist but apparently a Scotchmanite of some sort. Note that while the Spanish Communist Party had been founded on a decade and a half earlier, the counter lag of politics of the anarcho-syndicalists and the reformism of the Socialist Party. Successive exposure had driven from the party any leaders who might question the line coming from Stalin in Moscow, and the line was now to promote a popular front with the bourgeois Republicans. When the CNT and the Socialist Party left ditch about what to do with the government, the Communist Party and the Russian ambassador urged them to join a coalition government, abjure talk of revolution, and restrict themselves to purely Republican anti-fascist policies. They argued this would be when support of the middle class stopped all the capitalists and landowners going over to the fascists, and by look in favor by the French and British government. It will also be able to unite members of the various militias into a single centralized army under the command of those professional officers who had stuck by the Republic. Hobbes was second this assembly. Both the Spanish government and, more to the point, the communists who were increasingly influential in its affairs insisted that social revolution was not their object, and indeed basically did what they could to control and reverse it. Revolution, both insisted, was not the issue. The defense of democracy was. George Orwell likewise noted that the Communist Party, with Soviet Russia behind it, had thrown its whole weight against the revolution. It was the Communist thesis that revolution at its stage would be fatal and was to aim at Spain was not workers' control but bourgeois democracy. Another contemporary account was Rudolf Rocker stated the communists under orders from Moscow and once lined up with the right. They, who previously had never been able to speak contemptuously enough of the CNT and the anarchists because of their petty bourgeois tendencies, suddenly turned defenders not only of the petty bourgeois but of the Spanish big bourgeoisie against demands of the workers immediately after the occurrence of July 1936. The Communist Party had proclaimed the slogan for the Democratic Republic against socialism as early as August 8th of last year. The Communist deputy, Hernandez, had violently attacked the CNT in Madrid because of taking over of the industrial plant by worker syndicates, and in connection had declared that after Franco had been beaten, they will soon bring the anarchists to their senses. In Spain, the attacks of the Stalinists were direct, and guess all the accomplishment had been born of the events of July 1936. It was they who zealously urged upon the government the suppression of the workers' patrol by the police. It was they who played themselves up as defenders of the middle class in order to turn these workers against workers. The further the great transformation in economic and social life proceeded and brought agriculture and industry under the control of the workers' syndicate, the harder would it be for the old power system to reestablish the old condition. And that was just what foreign capitalists dreaded most and were seeking by every means to prevent them. But no one had rendered them such a narrow service in this matter as Russian government and its instrument, the Communist Party of Spain. It was they who had anywhere to put most serious difficulties in the way of constructive activities of the workers' syndicate, and who today were annually seeking to destroy a work which is the very greatest importance of social development of a country. The Soviet Union was able to effectively dedicate terms and push the Spanish government to the right because of the position as a major supplier of arms. It was no coincidence that Orwell noted in the autumn of 1936, when the Soviet Union began to supply arms to the Republic, it was also the beginning of the rightward shift. This strategy of conciliation bourgeois parties with the Republic extended even to forcibly suppress the activism of anarchism and others on the left. However, respect of the private property and maintenance of the old state machine in Spain of autumn of 1936 do not mean merely restraining workers from struggle. It means somehow, by persuading or force, making workers surrender the gains they had made and give up control of the factories and estate they had taken over in July. It meant taking arms away from workers who had stormed the barracks in July and handing them back to officers who had sat on the fence. The Communist Party functionaries and the right-wing socialists argued that any attempt by workers to make social revolution would be a second civil war within the Republican side. Yet their effort to force workers to abandon their social conquest created precisely the enemy of such a civil war. It was they, not the anarchists of the extreme left of Boom, who would choose soldiers at arms from the front in internal issues. It was they who initiated fighting when workers refused to decollectivize property or obey the orders of the refurbished bourgeois state. It was they who began armed clashes that cost hundreds of lives in Barcelona in May 1937, when they insisted on trying to seize the city telephone building that the CNT militia had conquered from fascists 9.5 months earlier. It was they who unleashed police terror against the left, which involved the murder of leaders like Andres Nin and the imprisonment of thousands of anti-fascist militants. There was no other way a military working class would be forced to abandon this revolution and wait for the end of the war. As Hobsbawm, somewhat less critical, argued that the Soviet policy in Spain, rather than being a betrayal of revolutionary forces, was consistent with its gradualist approach elsewhere, and that its experience in Spain influenced the initial Gaulle approach in Eastern Europe after World War II. The interesting point is that it was not mere opportunism, or as the purists on the ultra-left thought, treason of the revolution. It reflected a deliberate shift from an insurrection into a gradualist, from a confrontation to a negotiation, even a parliamentary way to power, in the light of Spanish people's reaction to the coup, which was undoubtedly revolutionary. Communists could now see how an essential defensive tactic imposed by the desperate situation of their movement after Hitler's accession to power opened a perspective of advancement, i.e., a democracy of new type, raising out the imperative of wartime politics and economics. Landlords and capitalists who supported the rebels would lose their property, not as landlords and capitalists, but as traders. The government will have to plan and take over the economy, not for reasons for ideology, but for the logic of war economics. As consequently, if victory, such as democracy of a new type, cannot be the enemy of the conservative spirit, it provides guarantee the further economic and political consequence of the Spanish working people. The Comintern pamphlet of October 1936 does describe with considerable accuracy the shape of politics in the anti-fascist war from 1939 to 1945. This was to be a war waged in Europe by all embracing peoples and or national front government who resisted coalition, which was waged by state managed economies and ended in the occupied territory with massive advances in public sector to the expropriation of capitalists, not as such, but as Germans who collaborated with the Germans. in several countries, Central Eastern Europe, the world left entirely from anti-fascism to a new democracy, dominated and eventually swallowed by the communists until the outbreak of the Cold War. The object of this post-war regime was quite especially not the immediate conversion to socialist system or the abolition of political pluralism and private property. Examples like that, for example, Japan, before it became a full-on fascist state, there was the Jerry Blossom Society. A secret society was basically one of the first fascist groups in Japan who were influenced by the Soviet Union to some extent, by Iki Kiti, who wanted to establish state socialism, although by his admission, he hated socialism because it was opportunism. But the idea of the state controlling the means of production like the Soviet Union was preferable, turning into a corporation of sorts. This was Communist policy, as carbon recount was repeated yet again in the United States. In the case, forbidding access to labor radicalism in the interest of combination with FDR. In the following 2 years, 37-39, the CIA added just 400,000 members to those gains in the first 22 months. In 1939, the number of strikes was only half that of 1937. What is more, the union leader increasingly reverted to collaborate with the employers in the strict negotiation by the membership. In the auto union, there was an attempt to ban any publication not approved by the leadership, but there were to be no election in the newly formed steel union for 5 years. The spontaneous grassroots resistance from 1934 to 36 gave way to the tight control from above. Many activists tried to resist this trend, but as France and Spain, their efforts were made much more difficult by the behavior of the Communist Party. He had played a leading role in the militancy in 34 to 37, with many of his activities taking position as an organizer of the CIO Union Drive, and by their courage and daring have attracted large numbers of recruits. Until 1935, the Communist Party insisted that Roosevelt was a capitalist politician and the New Deal of fraud. Then it made a U-turn and welcomed Roosevelt and the New Democrats with its own version of popular front politics. The party worked with the union leaders to spread illusions about the role of those politicians and the disciplined rank and file trade unionists who might disrupt cozy relations with the Democrats. This continued for the next 10 years, except for a brief interlude during the Stalin-Hitler Pact at the beginning of the Second World War. It helped the union establish bureaucratic control over most unions, and control which they would use in the 1940s to destroy any communist influence. Its United Front strategy had failed to prevent either Hitler's repeated aggression in Central Europe or Chamberlain's deal in Munich. Stalin once again made a 180-degree turn. He abruptly cut his own deal with Hitler, ordered Western Communist Party to cease their efforts to combat fascism. After almost a decade of apparent total failure of the communist line of anti-fascist unity, Stalin erased from his agenda, at least for the time being, and only came to terms with Hitler, though both sides knew this would not last, but even instructed the international movement to abandon the anti-fascist strategy, a senseless decision perhaps best explained by a provisional aversion to even the slightest risk. Continue in part 2. Post-World War II duopoly. Arnold Mayer's characteristic of post-World War II civil strife and revolution in the global south and interaction between the USSR and the West in the arena as a global civil war is accurate to an extent, but at best it was far less than one in the years immediately after World War I. In many ways, it will make more sense to identify the anti-colonial struggle of the global south as a primary axis of conflict with the USSR, giving limited and opportunistic support to those struggling carry little risk and otherwise opposing them. The relationship between the two post-war superpowers was at least as much collusive as competitive, while the orientation of the United States towards revolutionary change was almost uniformly reactive or repressive. The USSR's backing for revolutionary change was cautious at best, even when the Revolutionary Party was not controlled by Moscow, and grudgingly hostile when it was either instigated by actors outside Soviet control or threat to the USSR desire for a community with the West. Examples before, during, and debatably not long after World War II, non-anarchist socialists had supported and collaborated with fascists on multiple occasions. For example, the first fascist state, the Free State of Fume, which is the only example of a quote-unquote left-wing or quote-unquote anarcho-fascist state, was only recognized by the USSR. It was controlled basically by rapists, and it was basically criminal gangs, and pirates. And the same thing with the Social Democratic Party of Germany, who joined forces with the fascists to take down the revolutionary communists in the German Revolution, or various left-wing factions, quote-unquote left-wing, within fascist parties before being persecuted, like the straighter faction of the Nazi parties, the National Syndicalist factions of the Italian fascists, the Left Kuomintang for the Kuomintang party, and to a lesser extent, the Japanese Cherry Blossom Society wanted a state socialism. But they did clarify that they don't want actual socialism, they want the state socialist style of the USSR, but with capitalism, even though the USSR was state capitalist. Or the left Kuomintang joined forces with the fascist Japan, or Stalin wanted to be the fourth axis power before Hitler's betrayal, or in many cases where fascists and Marxists joined forces to crush anarchists in Spain, or monarchists as well in Spain, Ukraine, and Korea, etc. Or Nazis and communists joined forces in the Weimar Republic during the Weimar Republic in many occasions, or even the communist faction of the Zionist movement joining forces with the Nazi for the transfer agreement. Or, if the Bolshevik model of vanguardism and centralized, approach to organizational struggle was actually gave the foundation. It became a model for fascist organizations. In the words of Nikolai Bukharin in the Czech Congress of the Communist Party in 1923, describing the Italian fascists, and I quote, adopted and applied in practice the experience of the Russian revolutions in terms of their methods in the advantage of combat. In fact, if one regards them from the formal point of view, that is, from a point of view of the technique of their political methods, then one discovers in them a complete application of Bolshevist tactics, in the sense of rapid concentration of force and energetic action of tightly structured military organizations. Or, in the words of Leon Trotsky, Benito Mussolini stole from the Bolsheviks, and Hitler imitated the Bolsheviks and Mussolini. Or the Leninist philosopher Tony Cliff analyzed of Lenin's approach to one-man management. And I quote, on the number and effective methods of disrupting the unity of workers as class, one of the most important of these is the fostering of competition between workers by means of piecework system. He added that these were used by the Nazis and the Stalinists for the same purpose. End quote. Or in 1931, as stated by Ian McKay, the birth of the Second Spanish Republic to 1933, the socialists had been in coalition government with the Republicans and attacked the anarchists, more specifically the CNT, and repeated in many ways of the UGT's collaboration with the quasi-fascist Primo de Rivera dictatorship of 1923 to 1930. Laws were passed with socialist help, making lightning strikes illegal and state arbitration compulsory. The Irish Socialist Republic had started their own civil war and for their own power, and many areas controlled by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, became basically gangs. Or in the words of Miriam Rosso Bernard, and I quote, thus the Bolsheviks entered a commercial agreement with Mussolini's fascist government soon after he assumed power in Italy. On the morning after the murder of the socialist deputy Matteotti, the Soviet ambassador called on Mussolini. At the very same time, when the German communists were planning to overthrow the state, the Russian government was not only making trade agreements with the German capitalist government, but even making secret arrangements whereby the Germans could invade the military terms of the Treaty of Versailles by establishing arms factories and treating armies on Russia's soil. Wherever clash occurred, the claims of Soviet foreign policy prevailed over the needs of the revolutionary class struggle. End quote. Or, during the summer 1923, joint meetings were held in both communist and fascist speakers urged an alliance with Soviet Russia against the entente powers. So, for several months, the German communist workers with the Nazis, and going so far as stage rallies and share podiums together. The communist leader, Ruth Fischer, even argued that, and I quote, he who denounced Jewish capital is already a warrior in the class war, even though he does not know it. End quote. This until the Nazis' leadership placed a ban of further cooperation. Carry on, I'm just saying. As Noam Chomsky described the Cold War, putting second-order complexity aside, it was for the USSR primarily a war against its allies, and for the US, a war against the Third World. For each, it has served to entrench a particular system of domestic privilege and coercion. Mutual relations between the powers were, to a largely unrecognized degree, cooperative, and they served to justify each other's domestic system of power and to facilitate each other's control in their respective sphere of interest. The USSR and the division of the post-war during World War II itself, Stalin was hopeful for a collaboration post-war relationship with the United States and Great Britain, with the comments of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Stalin shifted from tolerant struggle against the British, French, and Dutch colonial authorities by communists in Asia and the Pacific, to demanding their subordinate anti-colonial struggle to their support to the Western war effort. And I quote, the anti-imperial struggle and the anti-fascist struggle, therefore, tend to be pulled in opposite directions. Thus, Stalin pact with the Germans in 1939, which disrupted the Western left, allowing Indian or Vietnamese communists to concentrate happily on opposing the British and French, whereas the German invasion of the USSR in 1941 forced them, as good communists, to put the defeat of the Axis first, i.e., to put the liberation of their own country much lower on the agenda. This was not merely unpopular, but strategically senseless at the time, when the colonial empires of the West were at their most vulnerable, if not actually collapsing. Vladimir Sobuk, in the history of the Cold War, incorporated newly opened Soviet archives citing correspondence between Molotov and Stalin. Hitler attacked on the USSR June 22, 1941, and the Japanese attack on the United States on December 7, 1941, brought the two nations together for the first time. Even as the Nazis were advancing to the banks of the Volga, Roosevelt invited the Soviets to become core organizer of the post-war security community. The American president told Molotov in Washington negotiating in late May 1942 that it would be necessary to create an international police force in order to prevent war in the next 25 to 30 years. After the war, Roosevelt continued, the victors, the US, England, USSR, must keep their armaments. Germany as its satellites, Japan, France, Italy, Romania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, must be disarmed. Roosevelt, four policemen, the United States, the United Kingdom, the USSR, and China, who had to preserve peace by force. This unusual offer took Molotov by surprise, but after 2 days, Stalin instructed him to announce to Roosevelt without delay that he was absolutely correct. In his summary of the Soviet-American talks in 1942, Stalin highlighted an agreement with Roosevelt and the establishment after the war of international military force to prevent aggression. Roosevelt's friendliness to the Soviets in Tehran and Yalta seemed to reveal his desire to secure a lasting partnership after the war. But Gabriel Kolko noted that Stalin's euphemistic willingness to abandon communist-led resistance forces and sacrifice their gain in U.S. and British-occupied Axis territory predate not only Yalta, but Churchill's cocktail napkin sketch of spheres of influence in Moscow that previous fall. In 1944, the Soviet Union approved the imposition of a conservative regime in Allied-occupied Italy, and from that time, the repeated endorsed Anglo-American politician initiates in those places applying importance to them. An irony is in Italy after World War II, when they tried to establish the new government, one of the first people in the Supreme Court were communists, and these Marxists were the same one who released all the fascists who were responsible for war crimes. Basically, no consequences. For the fascists in Italy suffer no consequences thanks to the communist help. The irony. Stalin and the Soviet foreign policy established expected Roosevelt to be reasonable about a combination the USSR ensuring strategic sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and believed the US-Soviet cooperation, despite possible problems, would continue after the war. Molotov considered it both profitable and important to preserve the wartime alliance with the United States, and Litvinov considered it the main task of post-war Soviet policy to manage good relations with both London and Washington and prevent the coalescence of the United States and UK into anti-Soviet blocs. It will shall see in greater detail the Western Allies established a capitalist provisional government in liberated Axis territory, often overseen by former Axis collaborators, and forcibly dispossessed leftist anti-fascist resistance movements from their gains on the ground. But they did so with the willing cooperation of Stalin, who, for the sake of maintaining a post-war partnership with Roosevelt and Churchill, was quite happy to throw Western European communists under the bus and ordered them to submit. even when they might possibly be able to hold on to power against US and British opposition. Colco raised the question as to why there was less chance in Southern and Western Europe after World War IV, 1944, when armed resistance forces might feel immense vacuum to discredit traditional conservative classes created because of so many of them were collaborators and fascists. Why, in such a context, there was no serious political crisis in any European country where the masses were radicalized, save Greece, reveals a great deal about the nature of the objectives of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party, as well as the origins of the long peace in Europe that has begun to erode dramatically since the demise. He elaborated on last very subjective clause of this quote by first asking whether the very existence of the Soviet Union itself as a hegemony over the communist parties indeed sparked the remainder of Europe by basically political and social challenges they might have confronted, challenge comparable to the far greater dangers Europe rulers faced after much less destructive wars of 1914 and 1948. Specifically, owing to his hostility to anything not subject to his absolute control, Stalin exerted a powerful restraining force to Western communist parties, whose new mass members were considerably more radical and unpredictable than their leaders. Given the overall balance of forces in Greece, Italy, and France after 1943, the left was closer to attaining power at the dominant power in at least two of these nations than at any other time before since. The vast number of the communists and other parties were not deeply indoctrinated or disciplined ideologically, but the communists' real problem was not the possible weakness the masses committed made late in the war, which communist writers later cite to exonerate their party's passivity at this crucial moment, notwithstanding the reality that in the main, if not exclusive reason for the restraint was Stalin's policy. The principal challenge confronting Stalin and his anointed leaders was to prevent the enormous number who were rolled from acting autonomously of the party line, which is precisely what they did in Greece when reprisal left them no alternative. For the communists at least, the greatest threat inherent in large memberships under tight elite control was the possibility of losing absolute mastery of their party's organization. Had the communists not exited or not played the role of a anodyne for social discontent, then there certainly would have been many more strikes and social conflicts, and quite possibly more truly revolutionary challenges in southern and western Europe than the one in Greece. Elsewhere, again, he stressed the central role of the communist parties facilitate the restoration of capitalist rule in Western Europe. During the critical period 1944 to 1947, the Russians gave the Western European social system a reprieve during which to consolidate its power. The United Front strategy was the key to communist political policy everywhere from 1943 to 46, and well beyond then in France and Italy as well. The only time the left posed a true threat to Anglo-American interests occurred when the Russians did not fully control it or when the breakdown of local social order was so complete that even the communists could not prevent a sharp response from the masses. After the war, many of the militants and communist movement who directed the leadership of the resistance found official conservatism uncomfortable, and the pattern of internal purges from within post-war communist parties followed the division between the theocratic conservatives and ex-resistant militants, often depending on who spent the war in Moscow or in home country. In Western Europe, the communists worked for elements of stability that reinforced the old order, no strikes, high production, and the like, and in fact took genuine pride in their very substantial administration aid in restoring the old order in a refurbished form. Capitalism survived only where the communists and social democrats were instrumental in reforming it. Elsewhere, upheaval and collapse ensued, and Anglo Americans and their allies had to apply sheer force against revolutionary responses of the people. In this sense, the left became the savior of Western European capitalism. Kolko raised the question of what would happen to Europe after the Axis defeat had Stalin not exited it. To mention Tito's independent Yugoslav communism as an example of the kinds of movement that might have come to power in Eastern Europe, as well as confronting the Western allies in Greece, Italy, and France. In short, Stalin and Western communist leaders who pledged allegiance to him desired disciplined party organization under their centralized control, not in order to wield them as instrument of revolution, but to restrain any revolutionary activity by their membership. Stalin and Western Communist Party arguably performed a function analogous of that of official union leadership under the Wagner/NRRB regime in the United States. este, of enforcing capitalist control against any potential direct action with the rank and file. According to Harma, the agreement at Tehran, Potsdam, and Yalta on the division of sphere of influence between the USSR and the West and the Western allies of Europe were a death blow to those hopes of resistance movements and gave Stalin's army a free hand in Eastern Europe. Stalin was not going to let communists elsewhere upset the arrangement by the attempting to lead revolutions. However, favorably the mass of the people might be, his former foreign minister Litvinov sped up bluntly to the U.S. representative in Italy in September 1944. We do not want revolution in the West. This was not just a matter of words. In the spring of 1944, the Italian communist leader Togliatti had returned to Italy from Moscow. He announced that his party was joining the despised by the government and was prepared to leave the monarchy untouched until the war was over. The French leader, Maurice Delors, insisted from Moscow that the biggest resistance group, the communist-led FDP, should integrate into accepting the leadership of the Gaulo's smaller FFI. Unlike this situation, other communist parties in Western Europe, the Italian Communist Party found itself taking second place in the resistance to the Socialist Party, untainted by any collaboration with the fascist regime. The Communist Party was, as a result, not only quite small but also more militant than is likely to have been absent the need to compete with the Socialists. They only underwent rapid expansion from 1943 on and then surpassed the Socialists in leadership until 1946. It's a matter of only months that the PCI went from being an unquestionable but disciplined Leninist sect to a mass party compromised on members whose future conduct was still unpredictable. With the Allied victory in Italy, the PSI, forbidden by Stalin to engage in insurrection, continued to organize itself as a mass party with the goal of achieving power electorally. They suppressed all ideological and class criteria for membership. There were no barrier for religious faith or philosophical convictions, and their December 1945 platform defended private property, religious freedom, and the family. But although its dream of becoming a party for all classes, the overwhelming majority of its members still came from urban working class and poor rural elements. The average communist was, in brief, far from being a heavily industrialized, carefully screened revolutionary, but more likely to be part of a local social human network that shared general political goals and a very personal arrangement that, under all sorts of vicissitude, caused both the party and its border to increase over the future years. Aside from the very militant force of its membership in the until recently German occupied North, the nature and strength of ideological commitment of most PSCI members in March 1945 are difficult to discern. Stalin policy persisted in the late 1940s to the extent dissuading the PSI from any attempt in insurrectionary seizure of power, even if a communist electoral victory were overturned. While in Berlin, crises were brewing. The imminent victory in the Italian Communist Party, or PCI, in April 1948 threatened the balance of power in Europe. Historian Victor Salavatsky has found ample evidence that the militants of PCI were prepared, if necessary, to seize power by means of military insurrection. Their leader, Palmiro Togliatti, schooled in Stalinist realism, however, had great doubts about the outcome of such an adventure. On March 23, he gave use a secret channel to send a letter to Stalin asking for advice. He warned that the Kremlin leader the PCI military confrontation with the opposing political camp could lead to a big war. Togliatti informed Stalin that in the case of a civil war in Italy, the United States, Great Britain, and France would support the anti-communist side. The PCI would need the assistance of the Yugoslav army and the forces of other Eastern European countries in order to maintain its control over northern Italy. Togliatti's letter invoked an immediate response from Stalin. He instructed the PCI not to use armed insurrection for any reason to seize power in Italy. Hobsbawm similarly observed that except in their Balkan guerrilla strongholds, the communists made no attempt to stabilize revolutionary regimes. The communist revolutionary actions made in Yugoslavia, Albania, and later China were made against Stalin's advice. The Soviet view was that both internationally and within each country, post-war politics should continue within the framework of an all-embracing anti-fascist alliance. Look forward to long-term coexistence, or rather symbiosis, of capitalist and communist systems, and further social and political change, presumably occurring by shift within democracy for a new type will emerge out of wartime coalition. This optimistic scenario soon disappeared into the night of the Cold War. So completely the few members that started urged the Yugoslav communists to keep the monarchy, or that in 1945 British communists were opposed the breakup of the Churchill wartime coalition, i.e. the electoral campaign which was to bring the Labour government to power. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Stalin meant all of this seriously and tried to prove it by dissolving the Comintern in 1943 and the Communist Party of America in 1944. Stalin's decision expressed in the words of our American Communist leader that we will not raise the issue of socialism in such a form and manner as to endanger or weaken unity made his intentions clear. For practical purposes, as this is revolutionary recognized, it was a permanent goodbye to world revolution. Socialism could not be confined to the USSR, and they are signing by Undeclared negotiation as its zone of influence, i.e., basically they occupied by the Red Army at the end of the war. Even within the zone of influence, it could remain an undefined prospect of the future rather than immediate program for the new people's democracy. History will take little notice of policy intentions when another way, except in one respect, the division of the globe, or large part of it into two zones of influence, negotiated in 1944 to 45, remained stable. Neither side overstepped the line dividing them from more merely for 50, 30 years. Both withdrew with open confrontation, thus guaranteed that the Cold War wars never become hot ones. Indeed, in 1945 to 47, where Moscow controlled its client regimes and communist movement, these were specifically committed to not building states on the model of the USSR, but mixed economies of the multi-party parliamentary democracy, which were specified distinguished from dictatorship of the proletariat. Still more of a single party that were described in inter-party documents as neither useful nor necessary. The only communist regime that refused to follow this line were those whose revolutions, actively discouraged by Stalin, escaped from Moscow's control. An example, Yugoslavia. Of course, the dominance of communists in the anti-fascist resistance meant that when the Allied occupation's regime collapsed, they were in the physical position to determine the successor's regime. When the German army was finally defeated with the variety contribution for local resistance movement, the regime occupying or fascist Europe disintegrated and social revolutionary regimes under communist control took over or attempted to take over. In several countries where armed resistance been most effective, Yugoslavia, Albania, and put forth the British and eventually US backed military support in Greece. Technically speaking, the entirety of the Balkans, let's be honest. Este, but Stalin was entirely willing to be deprived from the advantages of this position when it suited his interests. In 1944, he made abundantly clear to the ELAS resistance that could receive no Soviet aid, and the British backed government in exile in Kharkiv has his entire support. Indeed, Russian diplomats privately asked Churchill why he put up with Elas to borrow a line from Animal Farm. If you had your lower animals content with, we have all we have our lower classes. And at Yalta, he responded to Churchill's expression of communist guerrillas in Greece with, I have every confidence in British policy in Greece. After repression by the right-wing governments resulting in civil war in the late 1940s, Stalin refused any support to the guerrillas. When Yugoslavia's Tito and Bulgaria's Dmitry backed them, Stalin summoned them in early 1948 and angrily demanded they cease their support as an impossible challenge to Anglo-American regional interests, successfully in this case of Dmitry, but not to Tito. Yugoslavia was shortly thereafter expelled by the Comintern, finalizing the USSR-Yugoslav schism. In response to critique that there and any attention of power by Greek revolutionary forces would have been feasible in any case, Goko argued that American Britain, who had not forcefully overcome mass revolutionary action in Greece and Italy without jeopardizing their entire anti-German war effort, and that the domestic public would not have supported such intervention. But could such a revolutionary movement have taken power given the presence of massive Anglo-American armies? Communist writers have frequently argued that it would have been impossible, but such skeptical judgment entirely disregard the large context of the war with Germany. The purely military problems involved as well as formidable political difficulties that sustained counter-revolutionary wars we had encountered both England and the US. It would have been entirely possible for French partisans to impose their control in central Western France following the Allied advances in 1944, and any Allied if the effort to displace them from power would require the diversion of American and British troops from the anti-German offensives. At the time, when Germany was able to mount a serious counteroffensive in the Ardennes as late as December. American and British generals would quite likely have opposed such a move, would have it would have been Stalin to occupy more of Germany in the meantime. Likewise, had ELAS decided to forcibly resist British eviction from the territory they control in Greece, would have required a much larger contingent of British troops and undermined their war effort against Germany. In words, there was ample reason to believe they have armed left been ready to take power in these nations, who have been succeeded in part, if not entirely, for at least an indefinite period. Their potential for remaining power was at least as great as the one in Bolshevik in 1917. Foreign domestic political opposition would have been more formidable than even the military hazards. To convince British and American publics, or the troops themselves, or the need for diverting troops from the war against Germany to put down anti-Axis resistance movements and to replace them with fascist collaborators and monarchists would have been extremely difficult. Successful revolutionary actions by autonomous communists in Greece, Italy, and perhaps France would have been presented not only FDR and Churchill, but Stalin with their worst nightmares of leftist Western independence, both of Western and Soviet influence. Perhaps almost as much of his cynical opportunism and desire for European condominium with America and Britain, Kolko argued the Stalin abandonment of ELAS reflected his fear of any revolutionary force not subject to his complete control. It was at least as important to Stalin to profoundly mistrust the distinctive leftist combination that had emerged in Greece. Its enthusiasm and creativity, its mass-based and local intuitive, and all those independent attributes, and the lack of total internal discipline, he sought to expunge from communist parties everywhere in Europe so as better to control them. Even after the onset of the Cold War in 1946, Stalin pressured the Greek Communist Party, or the KKE, to participate in the British provisional government's rigged election and lend legitimacy to the regime. The KKE leadership, to no avail at its turnout, appeased both Stalin and Churchill by recognizing Greece as in British sphere of influence and asking many to participate as a legal party in a unified front government. It went so far to limit itself to calling for public order following the Nazi withdrawal and persuade ELAS guerrilla to stay outside Athens and let British forces occupy the capital. In France, Stalin followed the same pattern. He pursued cordial relations with the Gaulists from 1942 and on, and loyal back his goal and post-war power in Europe to greater extent than Roosevelt did. He sternly rebuked any communist, though, of taking power unilaterally, and assured the Gaulists in 1942 that he would not incite the French to create a communist regime. And as the US and Britain attempted to come to an agreement between themselves on the composition of the post-war provisional government in France, Stalin assured them in Albert Harderman's book that it was Soviet policy to leave the initiative in French policy to the British and ourselves, i.e. the United States, after the liberation of Paris. Stalin to continue to warn the Communist Party not to interfere with orders from the Gauland or from Western allies. Stalin's willingness to sacrifice foreign communists for the sake of friendly relations with the West held true in Asia as well. In China, Stalin distanced himself from Mao Zedong in order to cement his relationship with the nationalist regime, aka the fascists, and forced the Chinese Communist Party to agree to a truce with the nationalists in order to preserve his partnership with the United States. The USSR and Cold War lockdown over the Communist bloc. As the Soviet army advances into Eastern Europe, Stalin initially pursued a pluralistic approach to a provisional government established in liberated countries. This was especially true in the case of Czechoslovakia, where pre-war president Edvard Beneš maintained an excellent relation with Stalin, who was the first major power to recognize his London government in exile in 1941. Beneš repeatedly blamed the West's inordinate fear of the Soviet Union and communism for the failure to stop Hitler in 1939, and stressed the need for a realistic understanding between Western allies and the USSR if post-war Europe were to be effectively stabilized. As Soviet troops prepared to enter Czechoslovakia in 1944, Stalin was the only Allied leader to sign a civil affairs agreement with Beneš's exile regime, promised not to interfere in Czech internal affairs. In April 1945, as the exiled government returned Czechoslovakia, Beneš gave the Communist Party 7 of the 25 ministries in the government. The CP leader, Klement Kodwol, was a national communist rather than a Stalinist, and was highly rated as a sketch patriot by the London exile community. As Allied goodwill began to break down in 1949, the Soviet Union made it clear that should the Western power refuse to accept neutrality, Czechoslovakia would of necessity be expected to ally with the USSR. Czechoslovakia and Finland were outliers on the most liberal side of the Soviet Eastern European policy, but multi-party democracy in Czechoslovakia ended only in 1947, following several years of neutralism under left-oriented coalition government as part of the larger process of lockdown and Sovietization in Eastern Europe, a casualty of Cold War tension. In the aftermath of Hiroshima, Stalin began to focus increasingly on the need to secure Soviet control of Eastern Europe as military buffers against the West. And sorry, I was about to sneeze for a moment. Kroskov's son, Anatoly Sai, his father, is recalling that Hiroshima set the heads of the Soviet military spinning. The mood in the Kremlin and the general staff was neurotic, and mistrust towards the Allies grew quickly. Opinions floated around to preserve a large land army, to establish control over extended territory, to lessen potential losses from atomic bombings. In other words, atomic bombing of Japan may once again reappear in many of the entire Eastern European beachheads for the USSR. The new assertiveness of the United States after Hiroshima, which by the way was state-sponsored terrorism, was completely unjustified to drop the bomb because the Japan was all ready to surrender and they were losing to begin with. The difference between a world without bombing and without dropping the nukes with the world that is, like if they never dropped the nukes, the war only would last 1 week longer. That's it. It was completely unjustified. It was basically a gross tax display of dominance. And this new display of of forcement that indicate Moscow that America wanted to challenge the Soviet control over Central Europe and the Balkans. From that moment on, the issue for Stalin was not so much the presence of American military power in Germany, but rather the maintenance of Soviet military presence in Central Europe, above all in the Eastern Zone. Stalin openness to fully Sovietized the occupation regimes in Eastern Europe increased in 1945. After Western allies toughened their line against the Soviet Union, on August 2021, British and American representatives informed the Romania King and Bulgaria regent, along with the Soviet occupation officials, they would not recognize the new government in those countries unless representatives of pro-Western parties were allowed to participate in elections. They also encouraged domestic opposition to resist in the expectation of Western support. Stalin seeing this as atomic diplomacy in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese Parliament, ordered the Soviet military authorized to hold the line and make no alterations in the composition of the new Bulgarian government. Stalin's refusal to budge resulted in American recognition of the Bulgarian regime in order to avoid appointment token position figure to minor cabinet posts. The pressure towards Sovietization intensified in 1948 in response to the Marshall Plan. Stalin had been considerably strengthening his control over European Communist parties since 1946, but the establishment of the Comintern was accelerated by the Marshall Plan. It reflected Stalin's conviction that from now on, the Soviet could manage Central Europe only with iron ideological and party discipline. The Communist Party had to renounce national roles to socialism. They quickly became Stalinized and rigidly subordinate to Kremlin policies. The opposition of Stalin's control led to the purge of Tito's Yugoslavia. This was particularly true of Soviet-occupied zones in Germany, where Sovietization proceeded apace. Stalin's reading of the Marshall Plan left no room for German neutrality. The rapid consolidation of the Soviet bloc in Central Europe brought about great changes in Soviet policy in Germany. They shifted decisively toward the creation of the Soviets, East Germany, and the expense of the campaign for German unity. This did not allow the SED, a union of the Communist Social Democratic parties, which Stalin has encouraged as a vehicle for pursuing an electoral road to socialism, to become member of the Cuneiform. Yet the SED leaders, including the former Social Democrats, expressed unequivocal loyalty to the Soviet Union and denounced the Marshall Plan. In the fall of 1947, Stalin pushed the East German Communist leadership to organize military formations under the auspices of the German Directorate of the Interior, the police apparatus in the Soviet zone. In November 1947, a Department of Intelligence and Information that was set up inside the Directorate of the Interior with the goal of detecting and uprooting by extra-legal methods any opposition to East German regime. In the rest of Eastern Europe, likewise, the USSR followed suit by eliminating the non-communists from their multi-party people's democracies, or henceforth reclassified as dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. communist parties. In Asia, Stalin responded the same atomic diplomacy by playing the CCP against Xi'an government in Manchuria, seeking an agreement with China that would cement the Soviet position in Manchuria and prevent the penetration of U.S.-Japanese alliance onto the mainland. When Xi'an broke off talks under U.S. pressure, which by the way was a left, Xi'an was part of the left Kuomintang faction, the left faction within the fascist party of the Kuomintang, just like Stalin gave Mao a green light to expand his attacks to the major cities. Although they did so with caution and usually some reluctance, Stalin and subsequent Soviet leadership show a willingness, in the last resort, to maintain Leninist regimes in power in Eastern Europe by force if necessary. Although Eastern European uprising against pro-Soviet regimes will commonly framed in the West as being anti-socialist, the closest approach to an accurate generalization would be characterize them as libertarian socialists, as the recovering Marxist notion of workers' empowerment against anti-democratic and anti-workers authorities. This was nowhere more evident in 1953 uprising of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany, were sparked by an increase in work norms. As Chris Harma points out, the participants were anything but right wing. The section of the workers who struck those had been on the most left wing during the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. Some 68% of those purchased for the Communist Party in East Berlin for taking part in the rising had been members before Hitler's rise to power. They were all militants who saw the rising as a continuation struggle for workers' control to which they had dedicated their youth. Indeed, workers at the Stalin Alley construction project responded to placate attempts by Minister of Mines Silpo by taunting, "We are the real communists, not you." In 1946, the Soviet leadership went through a scares over Kulka's Polish road to socialism, but managed to bring him back into line without military intervention. Beginning in late 1956, Poland had become a hotbed of unrest in Soviet bloc. The collective leadership, despite the recent reconciliation with Tito's Yugoslav, viewed the Soviet Polish road to socialism as the beginning of the end of the Warsaw Pact and the internal discussion. The Presidium member used the same language as Pravat used. The Western imperials seek to separate us, using the language of national roles, and defeated one by one. With the aim of propping up the loyal Polish communists, the Presidium agreed to remove the Soviet KGB advisor from Polish security organs and provide economic assistance to the Polish state. But the experience in the GDR in 1953 was fresh on his mind. The Kremlin, concerned turned into panic on October 19, 1956, when it learned that the Polish communists were coming in plenum without any conciliation with Moscow to replace Edward Oka as their leader with Władysław Gomulka, who had been expelled from the Polish United Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Poland, and imprisoned from 1951 to 54 for nationalist deviations. At the same time, Polish leadership demanded that Soviet advisors in the Polish army also leave, as well as Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Soviet citizen of Polish descent who had been appointed by Stalin as Polish Minister of Defense. Khrushchev and other Kremlin potentates immediately flew to Warsaw to attempt to bully Gomulka and his Polish colleagues with tough words and raw power, using the presence of Soviet troops on Polish soil. The Kremlin delegate returned home on October 20 in an agitated mood. On that day, Presidium concluded that the remaining solution is to determine what's going on in Poland. The notes of Vladimir Manny at this point became explicitly cryptic, but it's probable that the Kremlin rulers decided to take primary steps to use Soviet troops and replace the Polish leadership after Kowalski was removed from the PUWP Politburo. However, the collective leadership temporized. Suddenly, Khrushchev suggested tolerance and admitted that military intervention under the circumstances must be cancelled. Presidia unanimously agreed. The main reason for the uprising must have been Gomulka's speech, planning after the Gremlin delegation left Poland has pledged to build socialism and fully obligation to the Warsaw Treaty of Organization. The Soviet intervention in Hungary only after original internal dissension of leadership of the of show to respond. And this is during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the only time in history where it was an anarchist revolution who successfully overthrew a Marxist state and it became an anarchist society for 2 months with complete workers' control of the means of production. On October 23, 1956, Budapest and the rest of Hungary rose up against the communist regime. On October 26, both supporters and secret enemies of Khrushchev and the Presidium approved the introduction of Soviet troops into Budapest. On October 30, the Presidium, however, switched to the policy of negotiation and authorized a declaration of principle guiding Soviet relations with other socialist countries. Foreign observers had long considered this declaration a perfidious trick on the part of Moscow, but historians have recently learned that this declaration resulted from the complex debate and the Presidium that ended with a decision to forego the use of military force in Hungary. The failure of the first indecisive use of Soviet troops to extinguish the uprising in Budapest and a number of casualties tipped the scales from Budapest. Mikoya and the Presidency appeal and Mastery defended the policy of negotiation and compromise with consistency and courage. Mikhail Sulzvo, another emissary, was applied to do the same. Suko and Malakov supported the withdrawal of troops. The proposal to leave Hungary alone split the Presidium. Bugani, Molotov, and Voroshivo and Kaganovich defended the Soviet right to interfere in the affairs of fraternal parties. This, of course, meant the Soviet military force could be used to restore communist regimes. Then foreign military Shevardnadze delivered an eloquent speech in favor of withdrawal. He said that the scourge of events revealed the crisis in our relations with countries of people's democracy, anti-Soviet elements are widespread in Central Europe, and therefore the declaration should be only the first step towards elimination of the elements of diktat between the Soviet Union and other members of the Warsaw Pact. Suko, Ekaterina, and Fortseva, and Matvei Saburov spoke one after another in favor of withdrawal. The non-interventionist momentum was reversed in the following day, October 31st, when the Presidium voted the same unanimity to order Marshal Ivan Konet to prepare for decisive military intervention in Hungary. Some scholars have attributed this starting flip-flop to external events, above all, reports of the crucial lynchings of communists in Hungary. Kumskov's fear that the collapse of communism in Hungary would cause Poland to be the next, and the Franco-British Israeli aggression against Egypt. There was also a large spillover effect inside the Soviet Union itself, unrest in the Baltics and Western Ukraine, and student hunger strikes and demonstrations in Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities. The deciding news that tipped the scale was the declaration by the Hungarian leader Irma Nagy, and this government had decided to remove Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. Contrary to the propaganda line of both Soviet Union and the United States, the Hungary uprising, like prior revolt in Italy, was not an attempt to capital restoration. It was a minimum foreshadowing as Czechoslovakia attempt at socialism with a human face. A decade later, arguably an authentic anarchist revolution. Peter Freyer, who was sent to Hungary by the British Communist Party paper, the Daily Worker, reported, and I quote, the striking resemblance of these committees, the Workers', Peasants, and Soldiers' Council, which grew up in Russia in the 1905 revolution and February 1917, there were once organs of insurrection, the coming together delegates elected in the factories and universities, mines and armies united, and organs of popular self-government, which the armed people trusted. A section of the regime tried to gain control of the movement, very much as Konka was doing in Poland, by putting another disgraced communist, Umran Nagai, at the head of the coalition government. On November 4, just as Britain, France, and Israel were attacking Egypt, the Russian tanks swept into Budapest and seized key buildings. They faced bitter armed resistance, which they eventually crushed only by killing thousands, reducing parts of the city to rubble, and driving more than 200,000 to flee across the border into Austria. A general strike paralyzed the city for more than 4 nights, and the Greater Budapest Central Workers' Council fulfilled the role, and in fact, an authoritative government to Russia's puppet ruler. Generals got tired, but eventually the Workers' Council were crushed too, and their leader sentenced to years in prison. The official communist line was that the revolution was simply a pro-capitalist fascist escapee planned by Western spies. But in so many other cases in the Cold War era, most common account of the revolution in the West was very similar. It claimed that the revolution simply aimed to establish a free society along Western capitalist lines. In fact, most of those who played the leading role in the revolution had wider perspectives. They remembered the pre-war dictatorship who had ruled Hungary in the name of capitalist freedom and look into the different systems which workers' council will play a key role, and even if the speed of events did not give them time to verify what this system might be, anyone who doubts this will have been various collections of documents from Hungary 1956 which have been published since. The Prague Spring, of course, was the actual locus of the slogan "Socialism with a Human Face," has Hamaklikans, leading figures in the party forced the president and party secretary Novotiv to resign. Intellectuals and students seized the opportunity to express themselves freely for the first time in 20 years. The whole apparatus of censorship collapsed and police suddenly appeared powerless to crush dissidents. The student formed a free student union. Workers began to vote out state-appointed union leaders. Ministers would grill on television about their policy, and there was a public discussion about the horrors of the Stalin era. Petty Kearney argued that the so-called Prague Spring itself was merely Lucas' attempt to replace the Stalinist party leadership with technocrats, which mainly mattered was the wave of activism from below, which is invariably unleashed. Secret notes of the role of the Workers' Council in Hungary in 1956. One can only speculate what had happened in Czechoslovakia. Este, in 1968 in the situation that really got out of control. But there are certain hints. Just in 1956 in Hungary, workers' council began to form and show remarkable resilience in struggle. Also in Hungary, the Soviet leadership hesitated over whether to resort to direct military intervention, but in the end decided in favor. But all archival evidence demonstrates through the Czechoslovakian crisis prevent Poe to avoid extreme measures. That is, military invasion. Instead, he preferred to increase military pressure on Tukbek and Czechoslovak leadership. Pressed for fear that the Soviet invasion would trigger NATO responses, leading to a European war. July 26 to 27, the Politburo, present over by Brezhnev, decided to set provisional state for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Soviets continued, however, to negotiate with Dubek and Czechoslovak leadership and tried to bully Sasha Dubek into drastic measures to reverse liberalization and reform. Once all their attempts failed, the Kremlin leaders finally made a decision in August 21, and the forces of the Soviet Union, other countries of the Warsaw Pact, except for Romania, occupied Czechoslovakia. Even so, the letter of passive resistance was that the Soviets were forced to restore the leadership under a tight lead and work through them to bring Kotonga under control. They expected to be able to crush the dissident overnight, but the immediate effect was to deepen and widen it. There was limited physical resistance to the Russian tanks by enormous passive opposition. Russia was forced to allow the Czechoslovakian government to return home with a promise to bring dissidents under control. This was 9 months interspersed with demonstration strikes. And before his promise was fulfilled, eventually Russia succeeded in imposing a puppet government with silence overt opposition by driving people from their jobs and in some cases imprisoning them. Stalinist state capitalism was to run Czechoslovakia for another 20 years. Even after the restoration, este, there were ongoing efforts by the workers to recuperate workers' councils, originally imposed by the state as a control to reform effort into genuine organs of self-management. Even after Tupac announced the discontinue of workers' council, workers at several enterprises continued to elect them in defiance. In the Soviet Union, Pravda ran an article attacking the very idea of workers' councils as anti-communist propaganda from the imperialist camp. He warned that the demand to hand over enterprises directly to ownership and management of production collectives is particularly dangerous. Anarcho-syndicalism is a step towards corporatism and fractionalism, towards degeneration and capitalism in socialist society. Further, it will undermine the authority of the Communist Party, which is, parties are more important, I guess. The Soviet leadership was extremely reluctant to invade Poland in response to destabilization by the Solidarity movement, even as a last resort. Brezhnev knew it would end any hope for a revival of Detente, and even Otropov and Suslov were apprehensive about the consequences. In the end, Brezhnev was able to maneuver Jaruzelski into declaration martial law in order to avoid direct military intervention. The Soviet Union in the post-colonial world. Most of the post-war period, Soviet activity in the world was cautious and non-revolutionary. For several decades, the USSR took an essentially pragmatic view of its relations with the global revolutionary, radical, and liberation movements, since it neither intended nor expected to enlarge the region under communist government beyond the range of Soviet occupation in the West, or the Chinese intervention, which it could not entirely control in the East. Stalin kept third-world radicals like Nasser and Mossadegh at arm's length, regarding them with suspicion and failing to capitalize on their non-alignment with the West. Khrushchev, in contrast, saw the potential for anti-Western sentiment in Arab nationalist regimes and sought closer ties. The struggle against Molotov, the search for spectacular achievements, led to Khrushchev and his supporters to rediscover the potential of Arab nationalism in the Middle East. On July 1955, immediately after the devastating criticism of Molotov at the party Bellum, the president sent Khrushchev's new favorite Central Committee secretary, Dmitry Shepilov, on a reconnaissance mission to the Middle East. Shepilov met Nasser and invited him to Moscow. He also began to establish friendlier relations with the leaders of other Arab states who refused to join the Western Bloc. Chevrolet came back to Moscow from the Middle East, convinced that the region had great potential for another peace offensive against the Western powers. Andrei Sakharov and other nuclear designers happened to be invited in the Presidium on the day they discussed Sheparov's report. An official explained that the leaders were discussing a decisive change in a principle of Soviet policy in the Middle East. From now on, we will support the Arab nationalists. The longer term target is the destruction of the established relation of the Arabs with Europe and the United States, creation of the oil crisis. This will generate problems for Europe. It will make it more dependent on us. In the midst of strategic statement in Europe and the Far East, these regions provide new outlet for the Kremlin's renewed optimism and ideological romanticism. The consequences of this policy turn were immediate. The language Egyptian Czechoslovakian talks on sale of arms rapidly became to a successful conclusion, and a flood of Soviet-designed Czechoslovak weaponry streamed into Egypt and Syria. Moscow supplied Egypt with 500,000 tons of oil and agreed to provide atomic energy technology to no avail. Concerned Western and Israeli officials tried to resonate against new Soviet policies publicly and privately. The struggle between Moscow and the West for the Arab Middle East was the beginning. In the next 2 decades, it will generate an unprecedented arms race in the region and produce three wars. In the immediate future, Moscow will be triumphant and destroy Western plans contaminating the southern flank of the Soviet Union. At the same time, in the case of the GDR, heavy Soviet investment in its Arab client would turn Egypt and Syria into major assets, similar to East Germany, that the Kremlin could not afford to lose. The Middle Eastern venture became a geopolitical gamble but it ended as a contributing factor for the Soviet imperial overstretch of the 1970s. Even so, Khrushchev limited itself to the most part to seeking common anti-Western alignment with the existing bourgeois nationalist regimes in the Third World, rather than actively providing revolutionary changes, at least until interventions in Angola and Mozambique in the 1970s. Soviet support for communist revolution in the Third World was generally in response to pressure from the latter. Both sides, Hobsbawm stated, tactically accepted the boundaries of each other's zones of influence, and during the 1950s and 60s, no indigenous revolutionary change appeared on the globe to disturb this balance, except in Cuba. Hobsbawm adds, the revolutions of the 1950s in the Middle East, Egypt in 52 and Iraq in 58, contrary to Western fears, did not change the balance, in spite of providing much scope for USSR diplomatic successes, chiefly because the local regimes eliminated their own communists ruthlessly, but they were influential as in Syria and Iraq. This process continued in the Khrushchev years as a number of homegrown revolutions, in which communist parties played no significant part, came to power under their own steam, notably Cuba in 1959 and Algeria in 1962. African decolonization also brought to power national leaders who asked for nothing better than the title of anti-imperialist, socialist, and friends of the Soviet Union, especially when the latter brought the technical and other aid not tainted by old colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Sekou Touré in Guinea, or Modibo Keita in Mali, and the tragic Patrice Lumumba in the Belgian Congo, whose murder made him a third world icon and martyr. The USSR renamed the People's Friendship University, established for the Third World students in 1960, Lumumba University. Moscow's sympathies with such new regimes had helped them, though soon abandoning excessive optimism about the new African state. In the East Belgian Congo, it was gave armed support to the Lumumba side against clients or puppets of the USA and the Belgians in the Civil War, with interventions by the military force of the United Nations equally disliked by both superpowers. The follow of the reciprocal granting of independence to the vast colonies. The results were disappointing. When one of the new regimes, Fidel Castro in Cuba, actually declared itself to be officially communist to everyone's surprise, the USSR took it under its wing, but not at the risk of permanently jeopardizing its relation with the USA. Nevertheless, there is no real evidence that it planned to push forward a frontier of communism by the revolution until the middle of the 1970s. Even if the evidence suggests that the USSR made use of favorable conjuncture, they had not set out to create Khrushchev's hopes. Older readers may recall where the capitalists would be buried by the economic superiority of socialism and the case of Stalinism and Maoism. Indeed, when Soviet leadership and international communist movement was challenged in 1960 by China, not to mention by various dissident Marxists in the name of revolution, Moscow's party in the Third World maintained their chosen policy of studying moderation. And capitalism was not the enemy in such countries insofar as it existed, but the pre-capitalist local interests and the US imperialism that supported them. Armed struggle was not the way forward, but a broad popular or national front in which the natural bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie were allies. In short, Moscow's Third World strategy continued to counterline on the 1930s against all denunciation treason to the cause of the October Revolution. An extreme example is in Japan, where the United Red Army of Japan, half of their members were killed by their own. Like it was basically a cult. The same thing with the Shining Path in Peru, which was basically a terrorist death cult as well. Like most of the third world nationalist leaders that happened during around this time, a main common cause that Castro was initially a billion best for the local Communist Party. And I quote, for radical, neither Fidel nor any of his comrades were communists, with two exceptions, his brother and Che Guevara, even claimed to have Marxist sympathies of any kind. In fact, the Cuban Communist Party, the only such mass party that America, apart from the Chilean one, was notably unsympathetic until parts of it joined him rather late in his campaign. Relations between them were distinctly frosty. The US diplomat and policy advisor were constantly debating whether the movement was or was not pro communist. If it were, the CIA, which had already overthrown a reform government in Guatemala in 1954, knew what to do, but clearly concluded that it was not. In fact, it's been proven in multiple cases that it was a liberal revolution. However, everything was moving the Fidelist movement in the direction of communism. From the general social revolutionary ideology of those likely undertaking armed insurrections to the passionate anti-communists of the USA in the decades of Senator McCarthy, which automatically inclined to the anti-imperialist Latin rebels to look more kindly on Marx. The global Cold War did the rest. If the new regime antagonized the USA, which was almost certain to do, if only by threatening American investments, it could rely on almost guaranteed sympathies and supports of the USA's great antagonists. Moreover, Fidel's foreign government by informal monologues before millions was not a way to run even a small country or a revolution for any length of time. Even populism needs organization. The Communist Party was the only body in the revolutionary side which could provide him with it. The two needed one another and conversed. However, by March 1960, well before Fidel had discovered that Cuba was to be socialist, he himself was a communist, though very much of his own manner. The USA decided to treat him as such, and the CIA was authorized to arrange for his overthrow. In fact, before that, he wanted to make allies with the United States, but rejected, even though he praised Abraham Lincoln as his hero, as admirer. But because of that, he joined the Soviet Union for opportunistic reasons. The Soviet model of development encouraged authoritarian, bureaucratic regimes in the Third World. Conversely, the ideologies, the progress, even the methods and forms of political organization which inspired the emancipation of dependent countries from dependency, backwards ones from backwardness, were Western liberal socialist communists and or nationalist secularists and suspicious of clericalism, using the evidence developed at the, for the purpose of public life in the bourgeois society, press, public meetings, parties, mass campaigns, and even when the discourse adopted was and had to be in the religious vocabulary uses by the masses. What this meant was that the history of the makers of the Third World transformations of this century is the history of elite minorities, and sometimes relative minutes ones, for quite apart from the absence of institutions of democratic politics almost everywhere. Only a tiny strata possessed the requisite knowledge and education, or even elementary literacy. None of this was the westernizing elite necessarily accept all the values of state and culture they took as their models. Their personal views might range from 100% assimilationist to a deep distrust of the West, combined with the conviction that only by adopting its innovation could the specific values of the native civilization be preserved or restored. The object of the most wholehearted and successful project of modernization. Japan said the Meiji Restoration was not to the westernize, but on the contrary to make traditional Japan viable. In the same way, the Third World activists read into the ideologies and progress they made their own was not much of a ostensible text as their own subtext. Thus, in the period of independence, socialism, i.e., the Soviet version, excuse me, appealed to decolonized governments, not only because of the cause anti-imperialism had always belonged to the metropolitan left, but even more because they saw the USSR as the model for overcoming backwardness by means of planned industrialization, a metaphor more urgently served to them the emancipation of whatever could be described in the country as the proletariat. Similar, what the Brazilian Communist Party never wavered in its commitment to Marxism, a particular kind of developmental nationalism became a fundamental ingredient in the party policy from the early 1930s, even when conflicted with labor interests considered separate from others. Nevertheless, whatever the conscious or unconscious objectives of those who shaped the history of the backward world, modernization, that is to say, the imitation of Western refined models, was a necessary and indispensable way to achieve them. And like I said earlier, there are many cases where the USSR had joined reactionary forces, like, for example, the Free State of Women, who was considered the first Marxist state, and it was the quote unquote the only left wing fascist slash anarcho fascist, you know, ever put in practice. Even though even though it has the word anarcho, they still believe in hierarchy. It was controlled by a rapist gang, and the only country that recognized the Free State of Women was the Soviet Union under Lenin. And the same thing with the former communist factions within the Zionist movement joined forces with the Nazis to do the transfer agreement. And 1 month after Israel independence, they almost broke into a civil war among the fascist faction, the Irgun, and the various socialist groups in the Harbin, at the Haragain factions. And the Soviet Union has supported Israel in its early years, despite the fact they committed genocide, also known as the Nakba, or when the French communists approved the shelling and the bombing of Vietnamese communists starting the Vietnam War, or the Socialist Party in Spain creating death squads to suppress the independence movement of Catalan and Basque regions. We can keep going with this over and over and over. Or during the May 68 revolution in France, the French communist parties and other similar groups joined forces with the bourgeois capitalists to suppress the movement, and which they pretty much succeeded. The Soviet Union took cautious approach to actual communist movements in the Third World, attempting to be restraining influence at least much as a support. Previously, the Soviet leadership had not ascribed any geopolitical importance to Vietnam and Indochina. They sought in vain to dissuade Hanoi from starting a war against the South. They feared historian Ilian Gaute could prove that this war would be an imperative to the process of the deterrent with the United States and its allies, the direct U.S. intervention. However, forces to the Politburo's hand, now the ideological code for fraternal duty prevails. In February 1965, trip to Hanoi, Korskin tried and failed to dissuade North Vietnam from a full-scale war against the United States. Even in the case of Cuba's mid-1960 Avengers in the former Portuguese colonies in Southern Africa, Yuri Atropo confined after the fact that veteran diplomat Oleg Troyanovsky, the Soviets were dragged into Africa against their best interests. The Soviet leadership itself was incapable of both schemes and initiatives. It took all the dynamic and ideological motivation players to drag the Soviet leaders into African gambit, including Angola's Agostino Neto and Ethiopia's Mengistu Haile Mariam, but especially Fidel Castro and his revolutionary colleagues in Cuba. Contrary to U.S. belief, the Cuban leaders were not mere puppets or surrogates of Moscow. Since the 1960s, Fidel and Raul Castro and Che Guevara, until his death in 1967, had and other Cuban revolutionaries had supported revolutionary guerrilla operations in Algeria, Sahel, the Congo, the Brazzaville, and Guinea-Bissau. Flight of the United States from Vietnam in 1975 was Cuba's belief a chance for another round of anti-imperial struggle in sub-Saharan Africa. According to one version, Gromyko and Kreshko and Antropov recommended that the Politburo send modest non-military assistance to the MPLA while cautioning against the direct involvement of the Angola Civil War. A few days later, however, the International Department transmitted the Angola request for arms to the Politburo. After briefly hesitating, the same Troika reversed its position and supported the request. In early December 1974, immediately after the Vladivostok summit, the pipeline for military assistance was opened. This reversal may be the result of lobbying by Soviet and Cuban friends of NATO. as well as bureaucratic long growing in the absence of previous direct involvement. 2 weeks after the signing of the final act in Jalisco, Castro sent Breckinridge a plan to transport Cuban regular army units to Angola. At the time, President Friendly refused to expand Soviet military assistance in Angola or to transport Cubans there. Yet by November, possibly the first Cuban combat troops were fighting on the side of the MPLA. Kornienko later asserted the Cubans outfoxed the Soviet military representatives in Cuba, making them believe they had authorized from the Kremlin to fly them across the ocean. Krumkio, Kreshko, and Antropov were surprised. They agreed the Cuban movement would lead to a sharp American reaction, complication for the Entente, and even tensions around Cuba itself. Meanwhile, the Cubans had already begun Operation Carlota to save the MPLA. What makes this story even more puzzling is the total absence of evidence coming from the Cuban archives in Havana. 2 years earlier, Crespo had done nothing to assist the collapsing socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile and rejected his plea for laws. In fact, China under Mao Zedong supported the fascist Pinochet era of Chile instead of Salvador Allende. And they also voted against Puerto Rican independence. Again, Maoist China. And they also, again in Maoist China, supported apartheid South Africa. So again, we just keep going with this nonsense over and over and over again. The increased integration of the USSR into a capitalist world order, one might even argue that the USSR fell behind in its struggle to offer a rival model of economic development. It went beyond collaborative competition and was to some extent actually integrated into capitalist world economy. In the immediate post-World War II period, the world communist movement lived in hope, and many in Western ruling circles in fear that the USSR would be competitive with the West in terms of economic growth. Only in the 1960s did it become clear that this had been an illusion. The idea of international politics is a struggle between two social systems represented by two superpowers become increasingly unrealistic. By the 1980s, it has little relevance to international politics as a crusade. The third world countries believe only public action could lift their economics out of backwardness and dependency. In the decolonized world, following the inspiration of the Soviet Union, they will see the way forward is socialism. The Soviet Union as a newly extended family, believing in nothing but central planning. The Soviet Union was progressively pigeonholed in what was essentially a third world export-oriented model in the international division of labor. And the irony, even though the US government has repeatedly cried that they are against the centralized central planning and nationalization, even though they did that in the space race for NASA, and they nationalized many things like the US Postal Service, PBS, NPR, couple of train stations, etc. It went full central planning and nationalization during World War I and World War II, which helped them their logistic administration ability to win the war. The Soviet Union was progressive if they keep doing this for the third world. So far from becoming one of the industrial giants of world trade, the USSR appeared to be internationally regressive. In the 1960s, its major exports have been machinery, equipment, means of transport, and metals or metal articles. By 1985, it relied on its exports primarily 53% on energy, oil, and gas. Conversely, almost 60% is import consistently on machinery, metals, and etc., and industrial consumable articles. It had become something like an energy production colony of more advanced industrial economies. In practice, largely its own Western satellite, notably Czechoslovakia and the German Democratic Republic, whose industry could rely on unlimited and undemanding market of the USSR without doing so much to improve their own deficiencies. The trouble for really existing socialism in Europe was that, unlike the interwar USSR, which was virtually outside of the world economy and therefore immune to the Great Slump, now quote unquote socialism was increasingly involved in it and therefore not immune to the shocks of the 1970s. It's an irony of history that the real socialist economies of Europe and the USSR, as well as parts of the third world, became real victims of the post Golden Age crisis of the global capitalist economy, where the development market economies, those shake and made their way through the difficult years without major trouble. One of them is Yugoslavia, who had a socialist market model, even though they did loans and they also had private property, and it was basically no different than the capitalist approach to free markets. At least until the early 1990s, until then, some indeed, like Germany and Japan, barely faltered in their forward march. Real socialism, however, now confronted not only its own increasing insuperable systematic problems, but also those of changing and problematic world economy into which it was increasingly integrated. For oil producers, on whom the USSR happened to be one of the most important the oil crisis turned black liquid into gold. It was like the guaranteed weekly winning ticket to the lottery. The millions simply rolled into effort, postponing the need for economic reforms and increasingly embedding the USSR to pay for its rapidly growing import from the capitalist West. We export the energy. Between 1970 to 1980, Soviet exports to the development market economy rose from just 19% of total exports to 32%. And again, the Soviet Union, because of its bureaucratic control, was against actual innovation. For example, the idea of the internet was first developed by a Soviet scientist in the 50s, but they rejected it because it was a decentralized, horizontal approach, very non hierarchical, and it was basically in principle the principles of anarchist communism, which the internet today still, for the most part, functions under the principle of anarchist communism in its structure of its functioning. But the Soviet Union rejected it because Stalin would not have a grab of power because of it. The West's vision of the post-war order, my mistake. The basic doctrine behind America's vision of post-war world was stated by Cordell as early as 1935. It's the collapse of the world struggle, the development of isolated economy that is let loose the fear which now grips every nation and which threatens the peace of the world. Formed from mere idealistic vision of an intellectual committee, is reflected especially economic interests. In 1936, Assistant Secretary of State Francis Here, Chairman of Roosevelt Executive Committee on Commercial Policy, warned unless we can export and well abroad our surplus production, we must face a violent disclosure of our whole domestic economy. These views mounted to a restatement of what had been a general American view of things, with William Appleman William Cole's open door empire. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the Roosevelt administration saw the guarantee of American access to foreign markets as vital to ending the Depression and the threat of eternal upheaval that went along with it. FDR's ongoing policy of open door empire confronted with the withdrawal of major areas from the world market by other darker policies of Great Eastern Asian co-prosperity sphere and fortress empire led directly to American entry into World War II. The open door empire ideology reflected the grand area concept formulated by State Department planners in the period immediately leading up to American entry into the Second World War. On September 12, 1939, the State Department and the Council of Foreign Relations began a joint planning project to analyze various long-term problems of the war and to plan post-war order. Its conclusion waited to be presented as a recommendation to the Department of State and President Roosevelt. After the fall of France, policy planners were horrified at the possibility that Germany might defeat Britain, capture some portion of its fleet, and cut off the empire from U.S. commerce. Assistant Secretary of State Burkett Long warned that every commercial order would be routed to Berlin and fail somewhere in Europe rather than the United States, resulting in failing prices and declining profits here and lowering on standards of living with the consequent social and political disturbance. The economic and social groups, one of the project's five study groups, accordingly began to study a U.S. dependence on world markets and resources and the viability of economic autarky within the Western Hemisphere. And the end of the war cut the U.S. off from traditional sphere of interest. The group divided the world into major blocks and created an input-output analysis of the production and trade of each block and its dependency on outside trade. It's found that the Western Hemisphere could not be viable on its own. The United States required at least a large economic bloc of the Western Hemisphere, the British Empire, the Far East, together compromising what was later called the Grand Area. And on October 19, 1940, the study group issued its conclusion and memorandum EB-19, arguing need to integrate the non-German world under U.S. economy leadership. Meanwhile, increasing portions of Far East would be integrated into Japan's greater East Asian prosperity sphere. Japan envisioned the latter as its own version of the Grand Area, eventually encompassing Indochina, Burma, Thailand, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines, in addition to the area already occupied areas of Korea, Manchuria, and northern China. Japan considered control of this area necessary for economic self-sufficiency, particularly in raw materials. The Economy and Financial Group met on November 23rd to consider measures to prevent Japan from conquering Southeast Asia and shutting out the U.S. On December 14th, all five study groups met with the State Department. Representatives issued a memorandum to Cordell Poor and FDR, dated January 15, 1941, stated that it was essential for the U.S. to maintain access to the raw materials of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Dutch East Indies. It proposed aid to China to tame down Japanese forces, air and naval assistance to the defense of Southwest Asia, and an embargo on war on material to Japan. Within 6 months, the United States implemented its recommendations of aid to China and an embargo against Japan, beginning the chain of events that led to war. Cordell Hull, in May 1941, stated America's economic aim for post-war world in terms were classic open-door empire. I quote, extreme nationalism could not be expressed in excess trade restrictions after the war. Non-discrimination in international commercial relations must be the rule. A raw material supply must be available to all nations without discrimination, including the careful limitation on commodity agreements affecting the consumer nations such as the United States. Lastly, in regards to the reconstruction of world finance, the institution and arrangement of international finance must be set up in their land to an essential enterprise and continued development of all countries to permit the payment through cross-asset trade consistent with the welfare of all countries. End quote. In July 1942, public address on economic war aims Paul elaborated its earlier vision. The four required American leadership in the world economy, the opposition of economic nationalism or new internationalism, which many Americans allies feared was synonymous with the American hegemony over the world economy. To the colonial nations, Paul's often repeated words convey undertow of a new colonialism. Through international investment, capital must be made available for the sound development of latent natural resources and produce capacity in, in global undertaking strokes on many allies as potential damaging to their interests. Leadership towards a new system of international relations in trade and other economic affairs would devolve very largely upon the United States because of our great economic strength. We should assume this leadership and the responsibility that goes with it, primarily for reasons of pure national self-interest. End quote. The proper access to foreign markets and resources was central to U.S. policy planning for post-World War. Given the structural imperatives of export-dependent monopoly capitalism, the threat of post-war depression was real. Already during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American economy was unable to operate at a level of output needed to fully utilize its production capacity. Wartime industrial expansion exacerbated this problem immensely by vastly expanding plant equipment at taxpayers' expenses. The domestic market was simply capable of serving sufficient output to keep the wheels of industry turning. Fears of post-war depression, when military preoccupied orders ceased and service members were thrown back to the civilian job market, weighed heavily on U.S. leadership. A war free from restrictions of the exports of both American capital and American goods by imperial trading blocs of autocratic arrangements by regional power was therefore very much a matter of national self-interest from the capitalist perspective of its policymakers. In 1944, in November, in an address to the Congressional Committee on Postwar Economic Policy and Planning, Dean Acheson warned the consequences if the war to be followed by a slide back into depression. And I quote, it seemed clear that we are in for a bad time, so far as the economy and social position of the country is concerned. We cannot go through another 10 years like the 10 years at the end of the 20th century at the beginning of the 30s without having the most far-reaching consequences of our economic and social system. End quote. The problem was markets, not production. You don't have a problem of production. The important thing is markets. We had to go to see what the country produces used and is sold on the financial arrangement which makes its production possible. Short of the introduction of command economy with controls over income and distribution to ensure the domestic consumption of all that was produced, the only way to achieve full output and full employment was through access to foreign markets. Based on their expenses of depression, along with the resulting revolutionary and military upheavals of the 30s, American leadership wished above all to prevent recurrence. They did not simply wish to repair the pre-war economy, but to reconstruct it anew. There was a remarkable unanimity in Washington in this objective, and it was far the most extensively discussed peace aim, surprising any other in the level of planning and through thought given into it. The American leadership will achieve this by creating a rational post-war global political and economic order. In the last analysis, the solution to the world's political problems could be found in rationally ordered world economy, and this kind of assumption called the United States response to specific problems in Europe, Asia, and Latin America continuously during World War II and thereafter. The resulting policy vision entails securing global grand area through institutional global economic governance. The United States, according to planning and post-war reconstruction, an American dominant world order even before it entered the war, the CFR Memorandum EB-34, dated July 24, 1941, stressed the importance of the grand area structure of reorganizing the post-war, and especially integrating the European economies under American leadership. And in the event of U.S. British victory, integration requires a conscious este program of broadly conceived measures for securing the full use and economic resource of the whole area. It followed up on an earlier memorandum of July 10. It recommended the creation of global financial institutions to destabilize currencies and promote investments in development backwards areas, what eventually became the Bretton Woods Institution. The grand area had to be protected above all from defection from within by any power which sought to remove its resources and markets for integration global economy. This vision of free world under U.S. leadership of any power which threatened U.S. hegemony as an aggressor to be contained. Consider predate the emergence of the USSR as a Pacific power playing the aggressor's role. Started very early in the war, policy planner unabashedly defined U.S. global hegemony as the central war aim. On December 15, 1941, Isaiah Bowman, head of the both CRV and the Territorial Study Group, wrote in a Foreign Affairs editor, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, the United States had to think of world organization in a French way and refrain from throwing away its arsenal at the moment of victory. It must accept world responsibility. The measure of our victory will be measure of our domination after victory. On January 16, 1942, Bowman stated in a memorandum that the U.S. after victory would have to adopt a broader vision of security interest to include areas strategically necessary for world control. So the United States already saw its future hegemony over other Western powers, and more particularly the Third World, as necessity at the time when the day-to-day survival of the Soviet Union was in grave doubt, let alone any future bipolar competition with nuclear-armed communist superpowers. Norman Davis, chairman of the Security Subcommittee of the State Department Advisory Committee on Post-World War Relations, and also CRP, stated in the meeting of the committee on May 6, 1942, the British Empire, as it existed in the past, will never reappear, and the United States might have to take its place. In the same meeting, General George V. Strachan, who had worked on the State Department CFE War Peace Studies project in 1940, advocated a mental view towards world settlement would enable us to impose our own terms, amounting perhaps to a Pax Americana. The first requirement for post-war economic order was a guarantee of access to raw materials in the Third World. Charles P. Taft, director of the State Department Office of Wartime Economic Affairs, predicted in May 1944 that the most metals and oil will eventually have to be imported. It was therefore necessary to export goods and capital for which the developing world will play only in raw material export. This required in turn the new vision of the open door, not as before merely priority of all foreign interests with the most favored nation, but also priority of foreign with domestic interests. This meant no protection, no import substitution at all for promoting third world industrialization. The second requirement was to expand foreign market to absorb increased output or prevent a post-war depression. The war produced broad, and in April 1944 estimated that victory in Europe would release 2 million soldiers and 3.5 to 4 million civilian workers from employment and reduce demand for industrial output by $27 billion. That meant replacing the lost war output with an enormous increase in consumer goods production. And as Harry Hawkins, director of the State Department Office of Economic Affairs, explained, the, the American domestic market can't be absorbed all the production indefinitely. There won't be any question about our needing greatly increased foreign markets. Finally, post-war order required foreign outlets for America's surplus capital. In an economy with such high levels of existing fixed capital and high capital labor ratios, further impose a capital have reached to the point of diminishing returns. The economy simply will not absorb large numbers of additional investment for any prospect of decent returns. Compound the problem, there was an enormous glut of wartime savings, which will not be profitably invested in domestic interests. Dean Acheson later looked back nostalgically in the British colonial system of the 19th century, which enabled Britain to export capital and maintain domestic political stability. And I quote, a system for the export capital much greater than our hand-to-mouth efforts is necessary. The system had been destroyed which expanded the power of Western Europe and permitted industrial development in societies in which individual liberties survive. End quote. American plans for post-World War came into direct conflict with those of its British allies. In the American vision, a unified world market free of regional economic bloc was to be enforced by the United States as a hegemonic global power. The United States determined to oppose its other allies, creating blocs and spheres of interest. They also shaped the future of the United Nations in the manner that acknowledged not just great power among other members of the Security Council, but also the distinctive role of the United States as the most powerful nation on earth. In contrast, The American vision of a single global economic order and presumably enforced by the United States as senior partner in the global concern with the United Nations is a barely disguised glove of the American fist. Britain envisioned a post-World War a regional blocs, including its own imperial trade preference and sturdy monetary bloc, and a Western European economic and security bloc under British leadership, an arrangement which would leave England with the Empire in a predominant position in a united Europe. This was the main source of friction between the Americans and British during the war. The American pressure reinforced by the leverage of land-based land lease was sufficient great to accept British assent to vague terms of the Article 4 of the Atlantic Charter. They will endeavor with due respect for the existing obligation to further the enjoyment by all states of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity, but during the war, the U.S. was still unable to obtain British ratification of sterling bloc or of imperial preferences. With the end of the war in Europe and determination on land lease, the rapid deterioration of the British financial situation, and the desperation for American financial system put an end to the struggle on American terms. And even though those who separate from the Soviet Union, like China under Mao Zedong, is not any better. China under Mao Zedong never was on the side of the people. They temporarily banned rock music and boxing. They joined forces with the Kuomintang on multiple occasions, advocated for closer alliance with the Kuomintang, supported Ken Shik during the program of the bourgeois nationalist Sun Yat-sen. And this is why Marxism, not just Maoism, is counter-revolutionary in practice. And for example, in Laos, capitalist reforms, many people in countryside are losing their lands, or the Wild State using military dictatorship, or Cuba shifting to private capitalism. 1 in 10 Cubans are in private enterprises, or Vietnam's wealth gap slash billionaires, or the homophobia. Vietnam has the fastest growing ultra rich population in the world, or North Korea Juche philosophy, which is a race based nationalism founded on Japanese fascism with a mix of foreign markets and national capitalism, or Vietnamese killing other communists with the French, or China betraying Vietnam during the Vietnam War, or China joined the U.S. with the support of Pakistani dictator Javad Khan, or Maoist China supporting Pinochet, or supported the South African invasion of the Soviet Angola, or you know, or joined forces with the Portuguese fascist dictatorship in the 1970s, or wanted to make NATO stronger against the Soviets, supported the Filipino fascist dictator Fernando Marcos, and in his attempt to crush Maoist guerrilla movements in that country, or the leading Italian government criminalizing all left groups as terrorists actively held by the government in suppression of far left groups after the Red Brigade is kidnapped and executed the politician Aldo Moro in spring 1978, or in more recent time using cheap labor for Amazon, or Bitcoin, which is a primary mine in China and Russia, or other capitalist corporations, or free zones where workers can earn tax-free salaries and overall killing any chance of socialism. You know, and look at China. Even after Mao Zedong reign, it still follow his authoritarian tendencies. For example, many anarchists and Maoists are forced to go underground, and people who subscribe to Marxism, like Yu Xin, who fights for labor rights and women's rights, gets disappeared because it's illegal to have independent unions, or her protest to poor labor conditions and a lack of social welfare in the Guangdong model. China is a capitalist oppressing Marxist, closed down Maoist websites, prohibit Marxist debates in universities. Despite Xi Jinping's Maoist rhetoric, 3/3 of employment is given to the private sector, with the capitalist system so bad that half of all female suicides in the world are from rural China. Financial surveillance in China's social credit system. If the or China backing the genocidal regime of the Khartoum, or building the Luna airport in exchange for 10,000 barrels of crude oil a day, or as the 2020 strikes are illegal, or the top 20% households hold 42% of total urban incomes, while the poorest 20% receive just 6%. Chinese helicopter launches have been used against civilians in Darfur, or communication or information, or Mao ordered the beheading of true anarchists, Guan Ai and Pan Guan, or trained Sri Lankan soldiers that did the Talmi genocide, or concentration camps against the Uyghur people, doing cultural genocide. Silence any Marxists who criticize bureaucratic supports. or supporting the Khmer Rouge, or supporting the Sudan regime from 2003 to 2018, or using the military to oppress workers and defending Taiwanese capitalist businesses, or removing the right to secession in 1949, despite promoting secession in 1931. Or in housing, in second tier cities, the price is about $1,500 per square meter on average, while the average salary for assembly worker are $500 a month. Despite Xi Jinping praising the economic Thomas Piketty, his law against work capital ideology is banned in China for critiquing China's wealth gap, ban on knowledge of class antagonism, Chinese and acknowledging that China is capitalism, or metropolitans heavy corporations join the World Trade Organization, admitting there is a market capitalist system. Commodity has been universalized using supply chains, food, housing, education, transportation, healthcare, leisure, socialization is not guaranteed except for the rich, which China has more billionaires than the United States and India combined. 300 million migrant workers are second class citizens in their own country. By the system of household registrations, workers which they leave their original location that are forsaking any right to stay subsidized reproduction. If the and workers without contract don't have legal protection, thus worse labor rights. Social insurance or health, if the insurance or pensions or work injury or unemployment or birth insurance are employing based, and people in the urban sector are richer, have more rights. The military brutally put down people's riots against police brutality. In 2018, 153 richest people in central government body had a combined wealth of $650 billion, putting a statue of Confucius in Tiananmen Square. Despite being the richest country in the world at $600 million in net net worth, Chinese live off $141.45 a month. Or if the calling anybody who supports Taiwan, it doesn't matter if they're socialists and support Taiwan independence, or others are group as anarchists, regardless what their ideology is. Or in 2008, when activists called for returning power to the people at an academic conference, the government declared the statement, returning power to the people, as the evil path of anarchism. Or in 1989, when the Secretary General and CPC declared are opposing those who advocate ultra democracy and anarchism. Or the CPC declared the activists in Square in 1989 for promoting of anarchist thinking. And the Hugo system is the same as the WIC in the US. When Xi Jinping is in power, they remove term limits, which means presidents are more accurately dictator for life, like Simon Bolivar, Julius Caesar. There's a reason why we must reject hierarchy, centralized authority, or all forms of states, because the worst case scenario is because of death code, like the shiny path in Peru, or the workers' institution of Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong in England, a literal religious group. Where the leader, Aravindan Balakrishna, took seven members, all women, as his wives, treated them like slaves, and this is why we must abolish all hierarchies. And there's no actual democratic decision making in China during Mao Zedong's time and today under Xi Jinping. China, where party insiders elect higher positions instead of making them electable by the people, because Mao and the CCP assume the masses are stupid and will not know politics. Thus, let's keep the state under direct influence where today is a mixed economy, wants to keep growing economically and making businesses easier by reducing workers' rights, makes exceptions for big corporations, let capital to go in there for their interests, which right now, if by 2078 it doesn't become a socialist, it will become what is the United States right now. This right-wing accelerationist, neo-Nazi monarchist, and narco-capitalist hell various cases during history, during Mao Zedong's era and after, of committing cultural genocides. Basically, anybody who is non-Chinese are forced to speak English and be part of their culture, like current conflicts over Mongolian language in schools or ethnic cleansing policies in Tibet. Or the Chinese government joined sides with the Kingdom of Nepal, giving arms to them against the Maoist Party of Nepal during the Nepal Civil War. Or supporting the apartheid Israel, that China is the second largest arms weapon dealer to Israel. It suppressed the Palestinian independence movement. If the who adopting the gigs economy with Ellen.me supervisor admitting is making conditions more difficult for the workers, having their own gulas called the laugia for the mass killing of landlords, which That's supposed to be a good thing for more socialists, but it just maintained the system, just replace a new class with another, which result of spontaneous killing by peasants, which Mao supported as a hatred developed over centuries. Why should the landlords of all kill, rob, and torture peasants, but the current system still have wage slavery, privatization, and triumphs controlling certain sectors? Great Leap Forward was a giant bureaucratic disaster where the people were not in charge, but instead a central authority where select few were in charge, and the people had no say in the decision-making process. And the Great Famine was caused by 30% natural disaster and 70% to bad policy, a failure of democratic centralism, where the people had no say in the matter to do anything. And Lenin, or during the Soviet Union, Lenin had recruited many of the Tsarist people in their government. If the capitalism means the states that no bug, where people did not exercise power, if the Bolshevik used members of the old Tsarist regime in their ranks. In 1922, Lenin admitted the state apparatus as borrowed from Tsarism, or like in China, was also a counter-revolutionary movement, with Mao Zedong's party that in the end of 1926, only 66% of the members of the CCP were workers. But every year, the working people were virtually non-existent during Mao's reign in September 1930, only 1.6% of the members were workers. During the Civil War, Mao, Li Bao and Chute made proclamations that capitalist businesses, police, and Kuomintang officials made their positions, stay in their post to keep order. Or in Cuba, where Castro in 1958, his party was not only a liberal middle class movement, but had no plans for nationalizing foreign investment. And I quote, "We are not opposed to private investment. In Cuba they still use the U.S. dollar, which is dominated by former white Cuban elites, creating wage gap and racism. The state decides which is dominated by the former white Cuban elite. The and they say your future for job, and you have no autonomy. Este, or under March, China did various imperialism methods, like taking control of Tibet, where Chinese government led military support for Sri Lanka state against the Chalkiyas uprising to oppose the independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan, in order to avoid formation for a Soviet-oriented state to its west, or recognize the new Pinochet regime after the Soviet-oriented Atlantic government was overthrown in a coup, or support the UNITA, an Angola political party also backed by U.S., and the apartheid regime in South Africa. We'll see you on part 3. The West as counter-revolutionary slash counter-insurgent power. To the same extent or greater than the end of World War I, the United States late in World War II found itself faced with the problem of the left. The nascent civil war within the World War in the form of the masses in revolt throughout the globe. Despite the actual nature of Stalin's policy as conservative and stabilizing, even to the point of facilitating the West's control of its sphere of influence, the Western powers saw themselves confronted with revolutionary situation fueled by international communism, which it was their task to fold. And indeed, the peoples of Europe and colonial world were radicalized, but they were hindered by Stalin and his successors as much as it helped it. For example, the United States, the original Red Scare happened in the 1830 to 1860s, mainly in the Confederacy, as a fear they're going to abolish slavery and replace it in an anarchist or socialist society in general. Well, if the 1910s, 1920s, when anarchism was very popular and used movements like propaganda, the deed, illegalism, insurrectionism, which was so successful to an extent that it feared the capitalists to the point that almost every country in the world, mainly Europe, regardless of political or economic system, united in a conference against the anarchist influence by declaring the first global war on terror, which created the Interpol, with this scale of international cooperation, mainly Europe, has never seen before, as a goal to eliminate anarchist influences. Despite the actual nature of this, if the Western powers showed themselves to confront this revolution of communism during World War II, which was their task to hold. And the peoples of Europe and the colonial world were radicalized, but they were hindered by Stalin and his successors at least as much as help. At the same time, the West unwittingly pushed them onto a far more radical path than would have been the case to have been able to participate in the reformist coalition started urged them. In fact, this is not a thing that Stalin started. In fact, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Only 1 month after they took power, they eliminated labor rights and independent unions, and crushing any actual opposition to the current status quo. And they were their own choice, as Coco described the situation. However, delay its effects and the complexity of the reason for them, what would you radicalize a historically unprecedented fracture of Europe and Asia's masses and mobilize them into leftist political parties as well as armed organizations? And when with the fluidity of the traditional political and social elites in the fatal compromise so many of them made with diverse forms of fascism and reaction. The left emerged from the war not only far more powerful but more important with a degree of nationalist legitimacy that most of its conservative rivals could no longer claim. That so many revolutionary leaders also became unimaginable functionaries who had no intention of disobeying Stalin's strictures is essentially irrelevant. Very few people in 1945 understood the many ways which the USSR had become a major source of stability in the world. More important, it was the Communist Party and the resistant army's ability to take power rather than their intentions of Moscow's inhibition that struck anti-communist politicians as the crucial challenge facing them. In many state nations, the conservative perceive their task as not merely to block change, but to destroy entirely the capacity of those on the left to defy them in any matter, whether parliamentary or violent. It was the existence of such draconian constraint and the loss of freedom in the number of nations of the 1945 that created the principal problem confronting the left and altered the political landscape in ways that many appear an armed threat. In a context in which communist parties loyal to the Soviet line who willingly had acquiesced to be integrated into peaceful political milieu had they been allowed to do so. The stages by which docile parties were transformed into nominally revolutionary ones. All endangered certain attributes, most importantly, were the traditional ruling class's elimination of the ability of the Communist Party to continue along the essential social democratic route that the USSR or their own inclinations preferred. In a world, conservative forces compel leftists to act defensively or to face extinction, and what were described as revolutionary efforts in nations such as Greece and the Philippines actually became as unwilling and indecisive reactive responses on the other part of the here unknown man and woman. And the Communist Party in these countries were mass organizations supported by an influx of members who had joined the anti-fascist resistance during the war, from a background of diverse political traditions of the left and the labor movement, as well as previous apolitical people from the labor classes with no real political tradition at all. These people were about as far from the Leninist idea of discipline, obedient cadre as can be imagined, and at times it was impossible for the old party leadership to control many of their members. This was especially true when the repressive measure by Allied installed provisional governments or colonial regimes pushed them into defying Stalin's counsel of cooperation with the Western powers. Starting in 1943, when the tide turned against the Axis and the Western Allies began to consider the problem of creating a post-war order in Europe, according to Kolko, the Allies were faced with the total discreditation of pre-war status quo and conservative elite, with the likelihood that the resistance dominated by the left would seep into the power following the collapse of the Axis-occupied regimes. The United States and Britain, who used powerful communist movements emerging from Western and Southern Europe, and the central role of communists in the leadership of the armed resistance. The resistance attracted men and women who exhibited the courage and abandonment of nationalist revolutionaries. They developed appropriate leftist ideologies and might in time become social revolutionary actors as well, to purge not only the foreign invaders, but also those domestic forces of conservatism that collaborate with fascism and made its victory so easy. Would the Resistance Act, would the communists take over? If the historians have already examined the internal world of these movements in relation to global politics, it's also a fact that the American and British leaders at the time simply failed to perceive them clearly and correctly, for there was simply no alternative to prepare for the worst of face a possible effort to wrest of the West the political victory that was the objective of the military sacrifice and triumph. Given the collapse of the pre-war power of the social forces that had contained the left after 1920, the question confronting the United States and Britain was how to fill the vacuum and what to do with the traditional parties of conservative order. Between 1943 and 47, the Western Allies developed the first haphazardly and then with deliberate consciousness a coherent policy toward this dilemma. As the as the American and British contemplated a return to Europe during 1943 and 44, they also had to consider the problem of the political and social system that might emerge within nations racked by war. Everything they saw in this regard disturbed them. From throughout the Western and Southern Europe, the political tides were blowing strongly towards the left and challenging to the one unifying and fundamental principle both Americans and English share, anti-communism. On the other, Left parties in many nations were no less powerful and were frequently more militant than the Communist Party. During the 44 and 45, the dominant current among the now radicalized pre-war Social Democrats and Socialist Party was in favor of the united front of all the left to defeat fascism and build a new society for the failures of the left to collaborate more fully in the 1930s, nearly led to its total physical demise before the onslaught of reaction. The communists too accepted the concept of united front, making their political potential all more credible and frightening in areas where democratic freedoms existed. The role of the Communist Party in the resistance posed immediately problems of physical security which could not wait for time of revolution. And everywhere they looked, the American and British saw political danger at the left, and they were prepared for the worst or else risk political defeat after their military triumphs. The United States and Great Britain formulated Operation Rankine, primarily with such fears in mind. It was a plan against the contingency that Germany and its occupied regimes collapsed before the Overlord invasion, in which case Anglo-American forces would invade the continent in force, rapidly occupy France and the Rhineland, and land paratroopers in Hamburg and Berlin. As Harry Hopwood stated in 1943, it will obviously be a much simpler matter if the British and American armies are heavily in France or Germany at the time of the collapse. The West entered the division of the post-war when the United States and Great Britain took possession of former Nazi-occupied territory that became responsible for managing a population which had been politicized and radicalized into unprecedented levels. Although, when the war began, people in most nations related to society and each other with intense personalism and lethargy. By 1945, a great proportion of U.S. population had become politicized than at any time in its history, and the fundamental transformation of political attitudes and goals. This process of resocialization became essential precondition for the emergence of resistance movement, where a significant force transcended because it left a persistent legacy of political attitudes that might be the end of the war and then afterwards, shaped European politics long after the resistance disappeared in most nations as potential armed threat to existing political and class structure. And given the class nature of the occupation regimes and the very different response of social constituents to the Nazi onslaught, it was also inevitable that the occupied population should redefine their attitudes towards the dominant pre-war classes, especially where it was so profoundly compromised as collaborators. It was precisely the social and class nature of various resistance organizations, the political and ideological visions, and the potential for civil and class conflict they implied. The man made so fraught with implication for the future of various European nations as well as the international power balance as thematically linked to internal politics. This results in the emergence of the specter, to a degree otherwise unimaginable in 1939, of basic social transformation, even revolution, in the wake of resistance. The ruling circles, soon to be victorious Western allies from 1943 onwards, were confronted with the question of whether Europe should be swept by a wave of revolutionary compared to that following World War I, especially thanks to the widespread discredit of social democrats or collaborators and the leading role of communists in the resistance. Britain and the United States found themselves facing a Western European left in which communist parties had an outsized influence. After 1943, armies and the police forces they had once protected conservatives, political structures were, if not defunct, at least greatly compromised and emergently weakened. For many, potential decisive weeks or even months. In large portions of Europe, no credible armed forces stood between an organized and often armed resistance. Once drawn mainly from and allied with the working class and poor peasantry, and as consequence of political and administrative power. In short, at the end of the war, Great Britain and the United States were faced with the question of the extent to which they could permit the unprecedented radicalization and political mobilization of European population to define the world's political acumen and seize the fruits of their military victory from them. There be no indigenous repression forces capable of containing the left in former Axis territory, as the Freikorps and Mussolini had done after World War I, and the role fell for the American British occupiers themselves. And, as Kolko knows, they were abetted by the USSR, which played a stabilizing role in preserving the very existence of traditional capitalist social systems. As we saw, Stalin was more than willing to discipline communists and rein in their radicalism and liberate territories under Soviet control so long he has some hope of entente with the West. He did likewise with the communist parties of Western Europe, seeing it was imperative to such Anglo-American fears of aggressive post-war communism. Stalin pursued a policy of making the Western European parties much less militant at crucial points when most of their countless new adherents were being radicalized and were still far from disciplined. In Italy, there was a considerable tension between British and the United States over the nature of the provisional government. The British considered themselves to have paramount interest in Italy, claiming the right to play the dominant role in organizing a new government. FDR refused to concede this, but both Western allies agreed that the left should not be allowed to fill the gap left by the collapse of Mussolini's regime and gradually retreating Germany occupation forces in the north. Despite the publicly stated goal of defascification, both British and American officers found it far easier to practice to leave existing office holders at their posts, and British, soon imitated by the Americans, used the existing administrative system, including the police. Only the socialists were strongly in favor of totally purging the fascists from the administration, and even the Communist Party, if there was lukewarm on the subject. In fact, the CIA had intervened in the election in Italy to prevent the communists to win. And to sidetrack a little bit, this is not exclusively a European phenomenon. For example, in Africa, Marxists they actually contributed the de-development and underdevelopment of Africa. In Africa, there have been overlooked the same problem which they joined forces with religious leader reactionary forces and make state official religions. It was controlled and planned by the elite. Ruthless discrimination that, according to Octo, makes apartheid South Africa look tame in comparison with what Marxist controlled countries in Africa did, and discriminated by educated men. In Ghana, there were no trade unions, and everything was concentrated by the top. The peasants had no impact of governmental decision making, and the government allied with mining foreign capitalists, which led to their poverty. And all African Marxist nations with state power over the people contributed Africa's underdevelopment. Tunisia, which was led by educated elite white collar workers, which farmers, merchants, and an Asian class of commercial slash industrialists were limiting the activities of the people and make actions against rich farmers who use anarchist tactics like co-ops, and the workers lost their rights to strike in the mid 1960s. The government considered the peasants, which was 90% of the population in Tanzania at the time, a problem, joining forces with the World Bank. Ethiopia was the bloodiest example, with brutal dictator, capitalist economy, and famine. In Mozambique, inherited retention of colonial struggles from the Portuguese. In Burkina Faso, where Sankara was against trade unions. And many capitalist elements was adopted by his killer, Blaise Compaoré, and the military in all of the African Soviet states, represented by the privilege, which caused frequent military coups and civil wars, and many party members have made themselves richer, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, joined forces with these one-party dictatorships, have failed to achieve socialism but achieved political cynicism. And in Angola, Marxists arrested and killed Maoists, anarchists, and Trotskyists. Or at the outside of the Africa, we have in the Caribbean island of Dominica, socialists led by Patrick John joined forces with the neo-Nazis at KKK to invade the island and take over it. And also they joined forces with the Rastafari as well to overthrow the government. In South Africa under Nelson Mandela, they maintained the apartheid struggle. So many people who were collaborators in the fascist state of apartheid maintained their powers and suffered no consequences. So nothing changed under Nelson Mandela. If the Now going back with Europe, primary disputes between the Western Allies concerning Churchill's desire to establish a reactionary regime under King Victor Emmanuel III and Marshal Badoglio, a fascist collaborator in 1943, as the sole barrier to rapid Bolshevism. Immediately following Roosevelt's march in 1944, demanded that Badoglio be removed because of his unpopularity. Stalin came to Churchill's aid by recognizing Badoglio's government. Shortly thereafter, the Communist Party announced its intent to participate in the government with no conditions. Occupation authorities banned electoral activities during the period of military government, and the military authorities complied with Badoglio's request to censor all criticism of the king, government, and the army. The basic premise of American computational planning prior to the conquest of Italy was to maintain existing governmental structures, laws, and even official personnel so long as they did not conflict with military needs or ultimate political objectives. First, in Sicily, and then in Italy, the British and Americans increasingly relied on existing fascist institutions and saved in the most blatant cases fascist personnel. The commanders disbanded fascist organizations themselves, but retained their useful institutions and personnel. Later, they promised when military exigencies were less pressing, they would effect a more thorough purge. The Bergoglio government and the king also strongly opposed any serious dismissal of the fascists and spent most of their time purging the army of anti-monarchical elements. Predictably, the Committee on National Liberation vigorously complained that the Bergoglio government was carefully appointing ex-fascists to security and military posts, but such ex-fascists were politically reliable from the viewpoint of military occupation, and after 20 years of organizational responsibility, very useful for military efficiency. The Italian anti-fascist forces and their base of public support were particularly dissatisfied with these arrangements. Baglio and Victor Manuel said were universally regarded as remnants of the equally widely hated fascist order. From the moment they signed the long surrender until the end of the year, opposition to Baglio government grew intensified as part of the sustained political crisis that characterized Italian politics for the next 2 years. While backing of Stalin and the Comintern, the PCI leader Togliatti was able to enforce a non-revolutionary and cooperativist line over the objective of much more radical rank and file. However, he did not purge the party's mass membership of dissidents, like in the Japanese Red Army, which they killed half of their own members. A policy that left an ideological quite diverse and laid the way for the future emergence of Eurocommunism. When the Allies entered Rome in June 1944, the Committee of National Liberation refused to accept Baglio as the head of government. Churchill was furious and, joined by Stalin, raised the issue of whether this was even legal under the terms of surrender. But the new Prime Minister Bononi, former head of the Committee of National Liberation and a moderate constitutional monarchist, excluded Baglio from the cabinet with the approval of the United States. Petrios Neni's Socialist Party and the Leftist Action Party both soon became dissatisfied with the Bononi government over its lackadaisical approach to depacification, although the Communist Party remained neutral. Meanwhile, the United States was finally and unambiguously won the competition for influencing Italy. As Bononi developed closer ties with Roosevelt and pressed his desire to be integrated into Washington's vision of a post-war economy. When Allied forces reached Rome, leftist anti-fascist partisans got considerably harsher treatment than fascist militants and police forces had received in the South. To the Allied soldiers reaching the Rome region, the experience was strange indeed. Armed Italians, often in red shirts, waving revolutionary banners, greeted them, frequently after they had set up their own local administration. The Allied armies pushed some partisans aside, they even threatened them in the firing squad. They arrested many of them and threw them into prisons. The problem is a novel one. It is bound to be met with further intensity in the further north the advances go. One political officer reported in June whether these men were elected or not. Anglo-American officers decided that the partisans who had to place themselves under occupational authority. The basic policy urged tact and sympathy, but the partisans were to surrender their arms. If possible, employment was to be found for former patriots, as the military authorities preferred calling them. Indeed, the occupation followed the carrot and stick policy, those partisans refusing to hand in weapons facing prison, those cooperating being given special food rations and, if available, jobs, though not usually in the army and rarely in the police. Unemployed, the partisan was a medicine, armed, and danger. One thinks of troubles of Yugoslavia and Greece in this connection. One regional commander observed to his colleagues. The Western Allies also faced the problem of how to deal with the CLNAI partisan in the north, which was considerably more complicated because they were more numerous and were directly engaged in combat with German forces. The problem of the resistance the Western leaders understood by the end of summer 1944 was not in controlling the small part of the liberated rural area, but reducing the potential danger that very much large groups still on Nazi-held territory poses. The partisans had organized a strike wave in the industrial city in late 1943. In summer 1944, were trying to down a sizable German combat force and considered themselves the legitimate governing authority in the region. The British and Americans greatly feared that, in the event the German occupation forces withdrew, leftist partisans would take over the northern cities before Anglo-American military forces could move in. What the Communist Party was really to appease the Western Allies. The Socialists threatened to create a socialist separatist regime in the north after German withdrawal, a position that contributed greatly to their popularity compared to the communists. Throughout the summer, the Allies sharply reduced the quantity of arms trucked to the resistance, which had never been substantial in the first place, for purely military reasons. The resistance were tying down as many as 14 Axis divisions at one time. The Anglo-American authorities renewed sending in somewhat greater quantity at the end of September, But the OSS agents in partisan territory were able to have non-communist partisans receive first priority. Then, when the Allied military decided the Italian campaign had gone as far as it might be for the winter and should not detract from the war in Western Europe, it was possible to regard the problem of the resistance as mainly political, with constant references to Greece, Yugoslavia, and the threat of Bolshevism everywhere. The military authorities embarked on a resistance policy that was both military and political in its dimension. On November 13, General Alexander, Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, broadcast a message to the resistance urging them in light and winter conditions not to engage in large-scale military operations, to save their supplies and await orders and restrict their activity to smaller operations. To the Germans, it was noted that these allies could not initiate a winter campaign, freeing the Nazis for other tasks, including greater efforts to weed out the partisans. The resistance was demoralized and significant only to the communist leaders in the north, attempt to take the best possible face in Alexander's message. The German fascists were now in a position to consolidate their power, and the widespread hunt resulted in an unprecedented elimination of resistance leaders and members. Defections, death, and reprisals were everywhere. Ellen Dulles, Swiss director of the OLS, actually entered into clandestine negotiations with the Nazi occupation forces and secured their agreement not to surrender to the CLNAI and to maintain essential services and law and order until they could surrender to arriving Anglo-American forces. Despite this betrayal, German units disintegrated from low morale. Armed workers took over the major northern cities and occupied the factories in April 1945, and then handed over control to the CLNAI. Ignoring the commands of communist leaders, partisans engaged in mass reprisals, including summary executions of fascists. The Bononi government itself never directly addressed or dissolved the status of the area under the CLNAI political control, preferring to treat it as direct organization of resistance in the north. The Socialist Party and Action Party, however, hoped to leave their in territorial control as the basic of Reconstruction political order centered in workers' control to gladly help salvage the situation for the Allies by refusing to side with the Socialists and insisting on national unity, thus sabotaging the ability of CLNI to pursue regional separatism of their own. Finally, on December 7th, the CLNAI signed an agreement, the Protocols of Rome, with the humanitarian terms, and I quote, in return to the promise of financial subsidies, food, clothing, and arms, the CLNNI agreed to subordinate itself to the Supreme Allied Commander, not to appoint a military head of the CLNNI unacceptable to him, to hand over power to the Allied military government upon its arrival in the North, and follow the orders of the military government before and after liberation. The Allies obtained assurance from the resistance they would not create a revolution. End quote. When the Allied forces reached areas of their control, they removed them from power and revoked all decrees. The pattern in Greece was largely the same as in Italy, with National Liberation Front (EAM) under the pressure from both communists and the Soviet Union surrendering its gains to the British. Only difference was that when passed far enough, they eventually defied Stalin by fighting back. The EAM, after virtually possessing most of Greece and preceded the British forces in combat, willingly surrendered its arms and staked its future on the reliability of British promises and their smaller and anxious local allies. This adaptation was possible only because the communists in the EAM dictated over a movement they could barely control. But despite the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, and the Communist ELAS guerrillas going out their way to appease the British, surrendering arms, staying outside Athens in accordance with the Varixa Agreement, Churchill, following a long series of betrayals, backed the Greek army with pre-war monarchists and wartime Nazi collaborators. The conservative government installed facing a reality which the communists would likely come to power in an unfair electoral system, ignored its own obligation to ELAS and the communists on the Barricas, and resorted to escalate a series of repressive actions. The terror that ensued was ruthless and ultimately self-defeating. It began immediately after January 1945, truce and mounted in intensity. The regime systematically purged and the army and political bureaucracy of pro-EAM elements. There was a casual terror of random assassinations and beatings, and systematic repression by security committees and court martials that simply arrested EAM supporters and detained them without trial. The government tightly controlled trade unions and charged former EAA underground government tax collectors with robbery and looting. The regime now charged ELAS executions of collaborators as murders. Outside the Athens area, the government proclaimed martial law lasted until August. The police and their supporters beat up communists, news vendors, even arrested purchasers at random, and shot leftist reporters. Right-wing bands ruled many districts, doling out retribution at will. When the British Parliamentary Legal Mission visited Greece at the end of the year, they reported that wholesale terror filled the filthy, crowded jails with very minimum of 50,000 prisoners, and by comparison, the excellent, even comfortable prisons for some of the worst fascists were comparatively empty. Yet, as late as May 1945, Communist Party Secretary Nikos Sakariadis newly returned from imprisonment in Nazi concentration camp, attempting to purge the party of militant and enforce continued cooperation with the British and the rightist regime. But despite pressure from Britain and from Stalin for the Communist Party to function in electoral politics as just another party, given the likelihood of communist victory in free elections, the rightist in power felt they had no choice but to intensify the terror and repression. The result from the mid 1946 on was a growing civil war in which maintaining the government in power was beyond the resource of British, and the United States assumed Britain's interest in Greece and saved the regime from collapse with US funds and military advisors. In France, the primary issue of contention between the Western allies was whether to support the Vichy government, the Galed, or Dalan and Garchi, Vichy officials in Nigeria who collaborated first with the Germans and then with the Allies in 1942. Germany tolerated ultra-conservative Vichy regime and allowed it to administrate France's overseas colonies. Meanwhile, in the period between the fall of France and America's entry into war, U.S. policy towards Vichy and its colonies caused considerable friction with the British, who were at near war with the Vichy regime. The Americans had an ambassador in Vichy and engaged in trade with French North Africa, administered by Vichy officials Admiral Francois Darlan and General Maximin Weygand. In early 1941, they negotiated a trade agreement with the Weygand U.S. representative in Vichy, had positive impressions of both Petain and Darlan. During mid 1941, the United States courted Weigmann not only because of the wish to keep France from becoming a more active ally of Germany, which would have meant an open war with Britain, but also a possible future charismatic leader of Vichy and all of France, an alternative to the obvious rising star of Colonel Charles de Gaulle in London. In 1942, the United States prepared to enter North Africa theater and doubtful of the allegiance of the Anglophone Darlan, who chose recruit General Henry Garrett and obtain his legitimation of the invasion as a foil to Darlan. Should he refuse to cooperate, the Americans obtained Carras's cooperation without consulting the English. In return for the promise, the invasion will involve only American troops and will include southern France as well as North Africa. The United States chose Carter for the role, although he had no legal authority whatsoever, in order to create a political hero capable of subduing the now eccentric figure of the Gelao. Although Darlan accepted the American invasion, he was nevertheless assassinated by a right-wing figure with obscure motives, at which point Gaulle formally replaced him as a governor of French North Africa. Darlan, despite his acquaintance, had considered his authority to derive from Petain and Vichy. Guerrero simply pursued a neo-fascist internal policies which backed him with industrialists and bankers, his pro-American sympathies notwithstanding. Gaulle's anti-Semitic policy in North Africa and his political repression of Gaullist horrified resistant forces throughout German-occupied Europe. The Janssens Accords position might be stated as Vichy without Germany. Gardner was the lead spokesman for the group of conservative officers and industrialists who were both strong nationalists and opposed the undisciplined politics of pre-war France. They approved of Petain's national revolution with its idealization of the state and its chief. And Gardner publicly defended Petain and Vichy, but hoped they would also fight it if Germany invaded Vichy threats. Some of his important supporters were anti-Vichy, or more particularly anti-Darlan, but since the entire tendency was committed to throughout Anglophobia, they refused to cooperate with the Galau. Reactionaries and anti-republicans, Garra naturally saw his regime in North Africa as a refinement and continuation of Vichy. He and his followers viewed international communism as a great post-war danger at the desired defeat of Germany, and therefore they soon oriented themselves toward the United States. By being anti-British and anti-German, as well as opposed to the left, Garret was most useful ally for the United States, but that he represented traditional French right, which had barely any future in 1943, even with American backing. It was not long before French conservatives considered Descartes, who was shared many of the theological tenets of anti-republican nationalism, as more viable opponent to the rising left. Garret's politics were well known to many Americans working with him, and they regarded him as a useful antidote to both British dominated the Gallo and the left. Este, Admiral Liffey, a former ambassador to Vichy, went so far to argue for Petain as head of provincial government after D-Day. De Gaulle was regarded as entirely too soft on the communist resistance. In Britain, in contrast, wanted no political arrangement in North Africa with detractor from the authority of the Gaulle's French National Committee in London. In June 1943, Garot and de Gaulle represented the United States with fiat accompli, together forming a French committee, a national liberation which assumed the power structure of the government in exile. Meanwhile, de Gaulle himself only regarded his agreement with Garot as starting point by replacing Vichy in North Africa altogether. In July, he recognized the committee so as to reduce Garot's post to largely ceremonial status and concentrate power in his own hands. The United States' animate position to the Gaulle split reflected a power struggle with the British over the respective visions of the post-World War. British support for the Gaulle was keeping in with its goal of creating a Western European bloc under the leadership of Great Britain, a concept supported by the government in exile of Norway, Belgium, and other countries, which would enable Britain to assume the status of an equal with the United States in post-war order. The Americans understood these implications, and therefore they hoped to stop Gaulle's rise to power. When John Foster Dulles was in London, July 1942, on a semi-official tour, he told Eden the Americans would not walk out a block unless they stay concentrated around a great power. The British wanted to build up France into a first-class power, which would be on the British side. Roosevelt observed in his way to Tehran in November 1943. In France, unlike Italy, Britain's preference ultimately won out, and provincial government would wind up headed by Gaulle rather than by Vichy neo-fascists as the United States desired. Yes, you heard that right. After World War II, the United States wanted a neo-Nazi, neo-fascist state. By the end of 1943, the Gaulle was clearly in an ascendancy, and backing Gordon and other Vichyites against him was no longer a viable option. The United States accepted the inevitable and switched its strategy to strengthen the Gaulle and the Estonian resistance forces to control, consisting primarily of nationalistic military officers against the largely communist-dominated resistance forces inside France. By the eve of D-Day, the United States had become a primary supplier of arms to the international resistance, though never in sufficient quantity to permit large independent resistance operations, and they never knew nully sent arms to urban and communist controlled groups. Although the Gaulle in the United States flashed on and off regarding the allocation of pauper between his proclaimed provincial government and the U.S. military authorities in France, the United States was at least confident of his position on communism. The Gaulle himself went to great pains to get his information across, for he appreciated the United States might be willing to pull up with great deal to have a charismatic leader who could save France from the left. The American worried about the communists being one of the parties of the CNL. For this, they criticized the Gaulle, but they had no doubts about the political safety of the man himself, safe in relation to Britain. The Gaulle aides warned Americans of the Soviets as well as the communist menace from at least spring 1942 onwards. Murphy, one of the most sensitive Americans concerning communism, reported to Hall in June 1943 that Gaulle told him the French Communist Party had, by its resistance to Germany, gained put their place in France, and feared that unless a capable French administration is built up in time to control the communist element, there would be grave danger of widespread violence in France after liberation. In his opinion, he felt qualified to control the French Communist Party. The State Department received the same message from other observers as well. It did not take them long to conclude that any relationship between the Gaulle and the Communist Party was strictly one of convenience and quiet temporarily. The communist-led resistance forces, under the pressure from Stalin and the Communist Party leader Theodore, would fight on behalf of a unified national rather than class-based resistance. Largely acquainted both Allied forces and de Gaulle's leadership, the Communist Party anticipated in Gaulle's government. Indeed, Torres, after his return from exile in November 1944, banned strikes, demanded more labor from the workers, and endorsed dissolution of the FFI, the French forces of the Interior Resistance Forces. As a participation in the government, until 1947, the Communist Party enthusiastically embraced the role of enforcing work discipline on its memberships. On behalf of the Gaulle, given their relationship with the working class, only they could extract the indispensable preconditions for restoration of the world order production. The Communists became party of production, even the party of the speed up. The situation controlling the Western Allies in East Asia and Pacific was much of the same as Europe. The surrender of Japan presented a monumental and complex set of problems for the Americans. For every place the Japanese conquered, they shattered the old order of colonialism, or as in the case of China, the tide of local communist movement seemed irreversible. Anywhere in the Far East, China, Korea, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, the necessity of fending off the left and shoring up the stability forces of the region appear as a pressing task in the wake of Japanese military collapse. Only Japan, firmly in the hands of the occupied forces, will emerge safely. Elsewhere, the remnants of the Japanese army remain the last thin barrier of the triumph of anti-colonial resistance movement, generally leftist and political identification. In Japan in 1944, a growing fraction of the leadership saw mass radicalization and communist revolutionary. If it continued to fight an obviously unwinnable war as a greater threat than whatever consequence that might follow surrender. The U.S. Navy propagandized the leadership with subtle messaging that Japan would not be punished after the war, but the United States would renovate and incorporate into the American-led global capitalist economy. The given the option of Bolshevism, the alternative was much more attractive to the peace elements in and around the Japanese Navy and industrial groups. In May 1945, Harry Hopkins spoke to Stalin of the desire of the Japanese industrial families to preserve their position and save Japan from destruction. Together, these formed the elements of post-war order in which Japan, under American hegemony, preserved much of the conservative pre-war order. Following the surrender, Japanese military forces and Korean administration were immediately enlisted as proxies of the United States and Britain in suppressing anti-fascist resistance forces in areas still under Japanese occupation, recalling all former Japanese occupied territories. Harry Truman, August 14, General Order Number 1, commanded the Japanese to aid and assist the Allied takeover in precise matter. MacArthur dictated, and above all, not to surrender to unauthorized local armed resistance groups. In Korea, the United States had planned to assist surrender of Japanese forces as far as north as possible in order to preclude Soviet forces occupying the entire peninsula when they declared war on Japan. And este, with reasoning analogous to that behind Operation Ranking in Europe. Later, July 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff both readiness to occupy Busan, only second to Shanghai, against the contingency of sudden and unexpectedly early Japanese surrender. General Order Number 1 clarified the matter by instructing Japanese forces in Korea to surrender to the United States south of the 38th parallel and the Soviet Union north of that. And I quote, the American takeover of Korea vividly illustrates the principle of General Order Number 1. The Japanese were to transfer power directly to their hands to authorized occupation forces, and until then prevented the local left from interfering. On August 28, the Japanese commander in Korea wired MacArthur that communist and independent agitators are going to take advantage of the situation to disrupt peace and order. Since Washington was supposed to be both the American reply immediately, they was directed that you maintain order and preserve the machinery of government in Korean south of the 38th degree until my forces assume those responsibilities. Shortly thereafter, the Koreans were told by American leaflets to respect the order of the existing government. The Japanese, and not to participate in demonstrating any sort, include those demanding immediate Korean independence. End quote. In the Philippines, President Quezon went into exile at the time of the Japanese invasion, but instructed the cabinet and other government officials to remain. The American authorities told them to remain in their posts and obey all orders from the Japanese, but refused to swear allegiance to Japan. The United States intended to resume ruling the island through traditional elites once the war was over, and did not want to leave vacuum in interim which might fail by unknown and untested resistant forces for the island's traditional rulers to resist, and they were overwhelmingly already doing work on that course. The Wu had to the destruction of many of them and likely dominate Australian anti-American nationalist movements over much of the nation or dangerous power vacuum at worst end. Nevertheless, owing to the economic hardship of the Japanese rule and occupation of local elites, resistance forces did arise. They ranged from spontaneous peasant auctions denounced as extreme leftist actions by the communists against quasi-feudal landed classes to more apolitical guerrillas who resemble warlords' armies far more than the patriotic resistance forms they usually portrayed to be. In practice, these latter forces, most of them on the main island of Luzon, proved to next to wordless for anti-Japanese resistance, but crucial for containing the only political guerrilla movement that existed, the Huparaha. Despite the Communist Party's significant presence in the Hooks, it by no means exerted complete control. Although the Hooks were founded on March 1942 at the Communist Party's behest, many of their founding leaders had a background in previous armed peasant resistance groups. and engaged in several activities denouncing as left-wing extremists by the communists. They intended to pursue their own agendas locally, largely in disregard of the mostly urban and educated Communist Party leadership and their agenda, which, in keeping with the Comintern policy, called for a united front of all patriotic forces and loyal to the United States. In particular, the WHO designated PKP instruction to confiscate only the cause of collaborationist language and to share power locally with the landlords rather than directly controlling villages in their own name. In late 1944, MacArthur's forces entered the Philippines. Polk launches an all-out attack of the Japanese and established a People's Council in numerous towns. Three provinces elected an appointing governor of the PKP. By the Philippines of 1945, all that stood between the hooks and the full transformation of the agrarian economy was the United States military led by MacArthur. MacArthur's first order of business was to disarm the groups, with the help of the previously mentioned apolitical warlord resistance, which the Americans had kept in reserve mainly for this function. The American occupation forces restored native elites to power and, aside from a very few symbolic cases, refrained from any sanction against Japanese collaborationists. MacArthur released Manuel Roxa, imprisoned for collaboration, and installed him as the president of the newly independent Philippine nation. He and his successor conducted an ongoing war of constituency on the behalf of the rural landlords against the hooks. American willingness to ignore local elites collaborated with the Japanese and to install them as governing class was considerable part dictated by the desire for military and naval bases in the Philippines. What American government wanted, therefore, only the conservative comparator elements. The very close collaboration with the Japanese were likely to for grant. For this reason, despite certainly the Filipino people as a whole were bitterly anti-collaborationists, the official American policy viewed the collaboration with side toleration, and many believe the pre-war President Manuel Quezon or even Sergio Osmena in Washington were not themselves unfriendly towards them. Vindication of this suspicion came to an end on November 1944 when Osmena landed and laid with MacArthur and immediately assumed a statement exonerating those public officials who had to remain under post to maintain a semblance of government, to protect the population from the oppressors to the extent possible by human ingenuity and to confront the people in their misery. The counter-revolutionaries who followed the wake of American occupation laid the basis of the Civil War that followed soon. In China, the British favored a restoration of French colonial rule. The Americans initially preferred long-term trusteeship, lasting 2 or 3 decades, by some combination of the victorious powers, both to punish the French for their collaboration and enter the reign of the Gallo. The British in 1944 proposed a reoccupation of Indochina with French troops, pursuing without prejudice the final disposition of the country, despite a consensus in the State and War Department in favor of this. Roosevelt refused to approve it, although FDR once again rejected this proposal when the British resubmitted it. In August, they nevertheless included a French mission of the Montevideo Southern Asian Command. At the same time, Roosevelt sent mixed signals by refusing a proposal to arm anti-Japanese rebels because they might also use their weapons against the French. FDR continued to reject proposals for French restoration and renewed his proposal for multi-power trusteeship at Yalta. Meanwhile, in the Japanese, until March 1945, continued to rule Indochina with the Vichy French administration, but in March they replaced it with Japanese puppet government under the Emperor Bao Dai. It was around this time that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh began active resistance to both the Japanese and French. In July, the Viet Minh program, which they favored to Washington, demanded independence and expropriation of French property. This was followed by a declaration of independence of the Republic in August. The United States dealt with immediate threat of a leftist regime in Indochina by authorizing both a post-dam and a General Order Number 1, the British occupation of Vietnam south of the 16th parallel, but which obviously entailed British restoration of French rule and Chinese occupation north of it. From this point on, the United States was in the position of supporting to restore French rule in Indochina. Given the alternative, if the Americans support the restoration, if the France to Indochina was the logical step towards stopping the triumph of the left everywhere. Both in action and policy, the American government now chose to gamble on the re-ambition of French colonialism and disregard as they once have thought of it. By mid-August, French officials were hinting that French restoration would fully open the Indo-Chinese economy to the United States and England. At the end of the month, the Gallo was in Washington, and on August 24th, the conversation with Truman turned to Indochina. The United States, the president now called the law favored the return of France to Indochina. He had made the final pledge to France. It will shape the course of history for decades. During the rest of the Third World, we saw above the implication of U.S. wartime planning for control over the Third World in post-war order. It remained to consider the practical implication of those plans. The U.S. policy vision considered the colonial world, in particular, was to become the post-colonial or the world was the continuation of the grand area approach. Samuel P. Huntington described the dominant feature of the post-war period as the extension of American power into vacuums that were left at the decline of European influence in Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. The shift of U.S.-European power relation was legitimated by the common need to prevent Soviet or Chinese influence from replacing European influences. Where Americans devoted much attention to the expansion of communism, which in fact expanded very little after 1949. And in the process, they tend to ignore the expansion of the United States' influence and pressure from much of the world. Although the U.S. intervention into the war is commonly framed as driven by anti-communism, and the framing has no doubt been internalized by American policy, at least along the rest of their legitimizing ideology, the truth is quite different. The central aims of American war policy has been exactly what would have been had in the Cold War never happened, or the Soviet Union never existed. To guarantee access to cheap raw materials on American terms, to integrate the third world country into global division labor, which their own function is to export raw materials and to keep their markets open by force if necessary to Western industrial exports. As evidence, the anti-communism was not the primary American motivation in the third world. Coco argues that while there were many varieties of capitalism consistent with anti-communist politics in the United States, sought to advance. With an axiomatic in the American credo was the form of capitalism, if advocated for the world, was to be integrated in such a way that its businessmen play a central part in it. Time and again, it was ready to sacrifice the most effective way of opposing communism in order to advance its own national interests. In this vital sense, this World War role was simply one resisting the left by primarily of imposing its own domination. It was its clash with nationalist elements and diverse as they were, they reveal most about the US global crusade for had communism alone been the motivation of its behavior. The number of obstacles to its goals the United States confronted the third world weapon immeasurably smaller. American backed for even the most corrupt and authoritarian elites was not, contrary to a apologetic narrative, undertaken for the sole purpose of strategic defense against communist menace. The U.S. dilemma in an increasingly unstable third world was largely through its refusal to accept willingly the nationalist movement and thus to be the less developed nations. Indeed, it was the very absence of a significant communist role in most of the third world that revealed the growing importance of structural alteration crucial to the U.S. and the conservative role it played to safeguard its principal economic interests. America's vital interests goaded to technological change in the third world. By the decades of the 1950s, the U.S. was importing 48% of total supply of metals, compared to 5% in the 1920s. The very wealth of its economy now developed on crucial supplies from the third world. In other words, its motivates were direct continuation of the open door policy and the Grand Area policy that previously led by American intervention in World War II. And the primary Soviet threat, to the extent it existed, resulted their role as spoilers, interfering with American efforts to maintain their supremacy in the Third World, and from the role of their strategic power as deterrent to direct U.S. military intervention on the scale it would otherwise have taken in the absence of superpower dimension. To quote Chomsky, yet again, the reality is that the field of potential superpower conflict served to contain and deter the United States is far more ambiguous global design. Western analysts, including some of the most anti-communist variety, admitted as such. For example, late in the Cold War, Dimitri K. Simmons concluded that the removal of the threat of Soviet counterreaction as a deterrent against U.S. aggression allowed for greater latitude for unilateral use of American power against those who consider its interests easy prey. Simons went to make it clear that those interests were primarily economic. Moscow's current sense of overextension puts America in a stronger bargaining position, fist by fist, defiant the world deports. Paradoxically, the Soviet American reapproachment makes military power more useful as the United States foreign policy instrument. Those who contemplate challenging important American interests might think twice. If America had were relatively united, for example, the 1973 oil embargo probably would not have taken place without errors widespread perception that America would not dare to respond militarily out of fear of triggering Soviet counter intervention. Then too, the Sandinistas and key sponsor were bound sick to become a little more nervous over Mr. Korshak's potential reaction if America lost patience with their mischief. On the other hand, the Soviet threat also served as a convenient legitimacy tool for the policy the United States would have taken in any case, but perhaps with greater difficulties in obtaining public support. As Christopher Leyen and Benjamin Squash argue, for this country's foreign policy leadership, the requirement of obtaining frivolously coincide with those of the world order strategy that would be pursued even without the Soviet threat. That's not to say that America's pretense of defending the free world against international communism was just cynical ploy to justify defending capitalist extraction interests. It's more likely that seeing the world through their own ideological filters, the American leadership generally equate any natural threat to neo-colonial economic order with communist aggression. Privately and publicly, America's near-nervous attribute to the Russians and transcendent ability to cause, exploit, or shape even the most remote countries. They condemn extreme nationalism as objective communist tool, in spite of the fact that its leading proponents were often the most conservative Latin American or Asian bourgeoisie who advocated to advance industrialization behind protectionist rule, just as the U.S. had done after 1861. In reality, the Third World hegemony was American primary interest throughout the post-war period, and the greatest perceived threat to this hegemony was first the pursuit of policies like import substitution, economic diversification, control over the terms of foreign resource extraction, and other departure from export-oriented development model. And second, the demonstration of a successful carrying out such policies. For example, the National Security Council document NSC 5432, U.S. policy towards Latin America in August of 1954, stated that primary U.S. policy goal as to guarantee adequate access by the United States to raw materials essential to U.S. security and to guard against domestic pressures in the post-colonial world to increase production and to diversify their economies. Emphasis added, the mean of accomplishing this would be to foster closer relations between Latin America and U.S. military personnel in order to increase the understanding of and orient toward U.S. objectives, recognizing that military establishments play an influential role of the government. As the study group of Woodrow Wilson Center in 1955 report to the threat of a serious reduction in the potential resource space and market opportunity of West owing to the subtraction of the communist areas and their economic administration in ways that reduce the willingness and ability to complete the industrial economies of the West. In August 1962, NSC documented the U.S. Overseas Defense Policy asserted the right to intervene militarily in defense of purely economic interests. It was found that the developing nations involved in a way that forced congenial war environment does not only require preventing their manpower and natural resources falling under communist control, but guaranteeing the U.S. economic interest in the resource and markets of less developed world remain available to us and to other free world countries. As an example, U.S. fears are demonstrating a effect of interventive models of development. The State Department official in 1964 warned the appeal of upper land reform in Guatemala, and I quote, Guatemala is becoming increasingly threat to the stability of Honduras and El Salvador. Its agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon. Its broad social programs of aid to workers surpasses a military struggle against the upper classes and large farm enterprises had a strong appeal to the population of Central American neighbors where similar conditions prevail. End quote. The last year of World War II and the first year of the post-war era saw the rapid assembly of institutionalized framework of global economic governance and the assertion of political and military power of the United States and its allies over the Third World. In the financial sphere, the World Bank and foreign aid will play central roles in integrating third world countries into global economic system controlled by the United States and its sugar partners. The primary purpose was to facilitate export of capital. The World Bank was created to promote private foreign investment by means of guaranteeing participation in loans and other investments made by private investors, and to make direct loans to build infrastructure necessary to later private investment. The World Bank subsidized American capital export, in particular by promoting third world infrastructure. According to Colco, almost two-thirds of its loans went to transportation and power infrastructure, which American business needed to support local investments. In Laudatory 1982 Treasury Department report referred to such infrastructure projects comprising some 48% lending in FY 1980 as externalities, i.e. subsidies to businesses. It spoke glowingly of the economic benefit, especially promising the shift to export-oriented cash crop agriculture. Physical infrastructure projects, particularly improvement on internal transportation and communication system, often yield the extreme economic form on local cost of production, distribution, and/or market in a wide range of industries, multilateral development banks. Projects in the transportation sector, for example, can make economically attractive the cultivation of more fertile formerly isolated land, increase the mobility and efficiency of labor forces, and often induce the shift from subsidy to commercial farming, due to higher value of output. Translating to English, this means subsidy shipping costs encourage rich landlords to evict tenants in coalition with international capital in order to consolidate their holdings for cash crop export agriculture. A great deal of such infrastructure is situated as the facilitated removal of wealth from host countries. The investments supported by multilateral financial institutions, Coco argued, were unusually parasitic, not merely in the manner in which they use minimal amount of dollars to mobilize maximum foreign resources, but also because of the United States' crucial position of the world raw material force structure, both as consumer and exporter. This is especially true in the developing regions where structuring industries and cheap labor result in the smaller permanent foreign contribution to national wealth. The infrastructure loans not only subsidize the export of capital, but the need to repay them locks third world countries into economic model base of export of raw materials. First, most of the loans go to build an internal infrastructure with its vital prerequisite for the development of research and direct United States private investments. Then there is the fact that the repay loans in total requires the borrowing nation to export goods capable of earning them, which is to say, raw materials. The development banks are excellent weapons for propelling favorable policies in third world countries. Infrastructure aid on the Truman Point 4 program was conditioned on the receipt countries giving equal domestic treatment to U.S. firms and balance of payment support laws in the worlds of the Treasury Department. Encourage countries to adopt open trading policy involving the promotion of export industries and the reduction of tariff barriers which foster uncompeting import subsidies. This referred to the practice of structural adjustment loans or standby loans adopted by multilateral agencies in the 1960s, ostensibly as a deport relief, but really rarely to rescue the banks only risking debt in third world countries. In return for the loans to meet the interest payment, the country must adopt reforms like removing restrictions on foreign investments, increase to export oriented of the economy, reducing wages, deregulation to cut costs in export industries, and reducing import subsidy progress. Although such progress initially affected relatively few countries, the debt crisis of the early 1980s brought large numbers of deportations under their provision. Charlie Player compares that dependency favorably to peonage of systems of maintaining control. The system usually debts to help keep the potential rebellious borrower in line can be compared to point by point with peonage and individual scale. The aim of the employer slash creditor slash merchant is neither to collect the debt once and for all, not to starve the employee to death, but rather to keep the laborer permanently in debt through his debt to his employment. I will see you in the next part. Economic hitman John Perkins described in a similar terms. His job was to justify huge international loans that would funnel money to U.S. companies like Bechtel, Halliburton, Stone and Webster, and Brown and Root, to massive engineering and construction projects. At the same time, he would work to bankrupt the country that received those loans after they have paid U.S. contractors, of course, so they would be forever beholden to their creditors, and so they will present easy targets where we needed them favors, including military bases, UN votes, or access to oil and other natural resources. And I quote, the unspoken aspect of every one of these projects was they were intended to create large profits for the contractors and to make a handful of wealthy and influential families in the receiving countries very happy, while assuring the long-term finance independence and therefore the political loyalty of the government around the world. The larger the loans, the better. The fact that the debt burden placed on a country will deprive its poor citizens of wealth, health, education, and other social services for decades to come was not taken into consideration. End quote. Ideally, as Holly Sclera points out, the corporation ruling class prefers the more insidious styles of debt diplomacy. She gives the example of the IMF breaking Michael Manley's democratic socialist program in Jamaica, the more naked use of force of the patterns of the Chilean coup scenario. But at the intermediate level, the United States also has intelligent resources of fairly low-key covert action, and for assistance, the counterinsurgency campaign by friendly juntas. The national security community's capability for low-level intervention interacting synergistically with carrot and stick of depth diplomacy, serves admirably and allowing the U.S. to replace unfriendly regimes without the political risks associated with direct military intervention. Charles Paler's The Debt Trap is an excellent survey of the use of debt crisis to force countries into standby arrangement, facilitate coups, or provoke military crackdowns. She provides case studies of the Tuvalu coup, the overthrow of the Goulart in Brazil, the Pinochet coup, and the Marcos Declaration of Martial Law. Waldo Bellows' The Development Debacle is a more in-depth case study of the Philippines based on the extensive documentation of World Bank collaboration with Marcos and his authoritarian crackdown, giving him a free hand in imposing an austerity program politically impossible against a background of free elections. One colorful example of the use of economic weapons against a rebellious vassal can be found in the Nixon administration discussion of Chile. The goal, in Nixon's own words, was to make the Chilean economy scream, with total financial and economic embargo coupled with the exploitation of friendly ties to the military. As the ambassador Edward Corey warned the Chileans, not a knot or boat shall reach Chile under Allende. Once Allende comes to power, we shall do all within our power to condemn Chile and all Chileans to almost deprivation and poverty. As the Chilean example suggests, U.S. ties and military assistance to foreign military forces can be quite effective. When brought to bear in combination with economic warfare, the objectives of military assistance become clear when we see against whom it is directed. Mao's weapon and military aid and counter-revolution in the Third World provide a list of the military or executive depictions of political targets of the military assistance program based on the systematic review of congressional hearings on the program. Neutralism, leftist revolution, force of disruption, nationalism, radical states, homegrown insurgents, insurgencies in make to U.S. interests, political instability, extremist elements, political dissidents, insurgents, state-sponsored terrorism and their allies, other extremists, radical elements, radical revolutionaries, Arab nationalism, revolutionary ideas, leftists, ultra-nationalists, anti-American Nasser types, and Methodists. Government circles repeatedly make clear the main purpose of the military assistance program was to secure internal political and economic orientation favorable to the U.S. interests, not to assist in external defense. The NSC paper, Overseas Internal Defense Policy in August 1962, for example, has stated a change brought about through force by non communist elements may be preferable to prolonged deterioration of governmental effectiveness. It is U.S. policy what is in the U.S. interest to make the local military and police advocacy of democracy and anxious for carry forward the development progress. End quote. In congressional hearings of force assistance in Indonesia and Laos in the 1960s, spokesmen for the military assistance program drew a clear distinction between building up or cultivating friendships of an army on one hand and supporting the army's government. In Kologai with Representative Rancer in 1971, Undersecretary of Defense for International Security Affairs another emphasized the importance of military assistance in establishing ties with third world military leaders as a means of influencing internal events sometimes by the deliberate destabilization of unfriendly regimes. Mr. Nasser in some of these countries or provide assistance to the side they have seized the power. Secretary Nother, in his statement, we feel it is extremely important to maintain our relations with the people who are in positions of influence in those countries so we can help influence the course of events. Mr. Fraser, in your judgment, national security in the United States means internal stability in those countries. Is that right? Secretary Nother, not always. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. It means maintaining our influence in some areas of the world that are critical to our security. It means helping to promote as best we can the developments that are most in our national interest, but does not necessarily mean providing for the internal security of those countries. Sometimes it does. End quote. The policy community and associate policy intellectuals also indicate that national security have more to do with U.S. economic control over resources and markets than the military defense against external attacks. Hilton B. Goss, a Defense Department Associate Scholar, wrote a 1958 study on Africa, and I quote, the potential resources of Africans are needed on the side of the free world to aid in the preservation of U.S. security. A U.S. policy for Africa and Africans must be designed and implemented promptly, or we shall lose Africa. To obstruct nationalism to the communists, or to polarization on the basis of color versus white people of the world. End quote. In 1968, General Robert Porter, a commander-in-chief in the Southern Command, described the military assistance program as an insurance policy for private investment in Latin America. In an address to Pan American Society in New York, he said, and I quote, as final thought, consider the small amount of U.S. public funds that had gone for military assistance. As a very modest insurance policy protecting our very fast private investments in an area of tremendous trade and strategic value to our country. End quote. None of this is to say by any means that the United States policymakers like unnecessary resort to military coup or death squad regimes. The general progression method generally goes from the use of financial and economic power to covert aid to destabilization or repression, and only to outright military force as a weapon of last resort. As John Perkins has put it, and I quote, in countries like Ecuador, Nigeria, and Indonesia, we dress like local school teachers and shop owners. In Washington and Paris, we look like government bureaucrats and bankers. We appear humble, normal. We visit project sites and stroll through impoverished village. We profess altruism and talk with local papers about the wonderful humanitarian things we are doing. We cover the conference tables of government committees where spreadsheets and financial projections. And we lecture at the Harvard Business School about the miracles of macroeconomics. We are on the record in the open, and so we portray ourselves, so are we accepted. This is how the systems work. We seldom resort to anything illegal because the system itself is built on subterfuge, and the system is by definition legitimate. However, there is a very large caveat. If we fail, a even more sinister breed steps in. Once we, economic hitmen, referred to as the jackals, men who trace their heritage directly to those earlier empires. The jackals are always there, lurking in the shadows. When they emerge, heads of state or overthrow or die in violent accidents. And if by chance the jackals fail, if they fail in Afghanistan and Iraq, then the old models resurface. When the jackals fail, young Americans are set in to kill and to die. End quote. Although the policy elites are willing to resort to violence, often softened methods fail. Whenever possible, they prefer spectacle democracy in which the racial public choices is carefully managed to exclude anything punching on the real structure of economic power. According to Terry Crow, U.S. involvement in Latin America has been guided by the ideology of electoralism, which asserts that meeting for the elections would channel political action into peaceful contests among elites and accord public legitimacy to the winners. For example, Thomas Carruthers explained that democracy policies in El Salvador did not touch the major power structure of the Salvadorian society, principally the military and the economic elite, which were anti-democratic. The United States had no real conception of democracy, in which the military was not the dominant actor. The economic elite no longer held the national economy in its hands. The left was incorporated into the political system, and all Salvadorians had both the former and substantial possibility of political participation. Honduran policy likewise greatly strengthened the anti-democratic military and refined a formal electoral process that did little to change the anti-democratic structural features of the society. The U.S. Central American policy was based on the belief that a country is a democracy when it has government that came to power through free and fair elections. This belief ignored the issue of how much real authority an elected government has vis-a-vis economic and military power sectors, and ignores the various dimensions of popular participation, including the free expression of opinions, day-to-day interactions between the government and the citizenry, the mobilization of interest groups, and the like. The impulse is to promote democratic change, but the underlying object is to maintain the basic order of what are quite undemocratic societies. Democracy is a means of relieving pressure for more radical changes, but only through limited top-down forms of democratic change to did not risk upsetting the traditional structure of power which the United States has long been allied. The goal of all these methods together was make the American hegemony as a cost-effective and politically sustainable as possible. After its direct intervention in Korea, the United States tried to minimize costs to itself by relying on a previous strategy of indirect rule through third world local elites, which committed it in turn to giving those elites in power. The United States at the Korea believed that it might to avoid massive employment of its own troops again in the third world context by relying upon friendlier leaders and their enemies to cope with local rebellions, many of them radicals but not necessarily Leninists, aiding them with equipment, training, and funds, and turning them into proxies of American power. Annual military aid in the form of equipment, advisors, and training to nations in Latin America and Asia quadrupled under the Eisenhower and the creation of integrated regional alliances, CETO and CENTO to begin, further tied Washington's destiny and credibility to half of its proxies. Reliance on the military is the most promising single power group in the third world nation to give official policy, though this did not preclude support of the tyrants. Argumenting this dependence on officers for the United States' systematic effort to improve the ability of local policy departments to perform political functions. Public safety missions and equipment were sent to 38 countries over a 7-year period, and many people were brought from those states to undergo training in the U.S. Even more important was the great expansion of the CIA's covert activities and supremely flexible mechanisms that allowed the U.S. both to intervene in countless ways in innumerable countries and to deny responsibility in cases of embarrassment or failure. The CIA could not attempt virtually anything with impunity, and often did with great successes, as in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, giving Washington unconventional means to become a mesh of for better or for worse in many more nations. This has been an outline of the institutional structure and general characteristic of the U.S. domination of the Third World in the post-war period, and I like the speed to categorize all the specific examples of U.S. invasions, sponsorships of coups, training and funding of death squads, and the like. And to do so will require an entire book of its own. Just listing the major examples: the overthrow of Erzburn and Mossadegh, backing for DM Saigon regime; the overthrow of Sukarno; the assassination of Lumumba, backing of Mobutu; the overthrow of Goulart; the Vietnam counterinsurgency, Operation Condor; the Pinochet coup; the Contras; the Salvadorian death squads; aid to the Mujahideen takes long enough. Besides, there already is book recounting case by case with heavy documentation of the American retro intervention for the entire post-war period. I highly recommend two books by William Ball, Killing Hope and Rogue State, by far the most detailed books on this specific subject matter. I will highly recommend. By definition, the Condominium requires two parties: the sudden and unexpected implosion of the Soviet bloc and then the Soviet Union itself. In 2 years' time, therefore, conclude the period under consideration. The rest of the Soviet Party leadership and the leadership of the military and the KGB, Vladimir Subok writes, were blindsided by Kuvarevich's willingness to dismantle the Soviet Union Eastern European sphere of control and even Communist Party rule in the Soviet Union itself. The most formidable of the conservative strongholds, the KGB, still believed in early 1987 that Khrushchev was implementing Andropov's program of controlled conservative modernization and imperial retrenchment. It did not occur to the KGB leader that Khrushchev intended to dismantle the entire regime of police repression that had survived the destalinisation and become entrenched during the President Andropov years. Vladimir Khrushchev, head of the KGB branch for foreign intelligence, recalled that he had never doubted Khrushchev's devotion to the Soviet system and quote unquote socialism, and was horrified later by the extent of his betrayal. The conservatives, the modernizers, and the military realized that the Soviet Union could ill afford its commitment on Central Europe, Afghanistan, and all over the world, and they advocate cautious retrenchment to postpone the crumbling of the Soviet sphere of influence. In contrast, Khrushchev and the New Denkers began to proclaim a policy of non-interference in Central Europe, so they would be leaving Soviet allies completely to their own devices. Still, the Politburo majority, the KGB, and the military did not imagine that Khrushchev could be prepared to bring the Cold War to an end and the cause of the destruction of the Soviet external empire in Central Europe and its colonies, and fatal instability in the Soviet Union itself. Absent Khrushchev's stretched reform agenda, the Soviet system most likely would have staggered along indefinitely. Instead, he unleashed massive pressure from below that brought it down. Even the economy and finances in steep decline, the Soviet Union still could hide its weak conditions behind respectable Potemkin facade and negotiate with the United States from a position of relative superiority. After 1988, this situation tragically changed. Khrushchev's decision to launch radical political and state reforms, coupled with the removal of the party apparatus from economic life, created a most severe crisis of the state and produced centrifugal political forces that spun out of control within Soviet society. All of this was tantamount to revolution, was vision to the world, and engulfed the Soviet leadership. These policies essentially destroyed the Soviet capacity to act like a superpower on the international arena. The Soviet Union was left in no position to bail out its allies or to present itself as an equal partner to the United States in negotiations. There were few other examples in history of a leader in charge of a huge alien state who willingly risked a geopolitical position for great power and the very foundations of political power for the sake of a moral global project. By the spring of 1989, it became obvious even to Khrushchev's closest assistants that the radical reappraisal of Soviet ideology and history initiated from above had triggered a political deluge from below, and Khrushchev himself was constitutionally incapable or unwilling to resort to force to preserve the system when it became clear it would otherwise collapse. An additional feature of Khrushchev's personality that perplexed contemporaries and witnesses was his deep aversion to the use of force. To be sure, skepticism about military force was widely shared among the new thinkers. It can also be regarded as a generational phenomenon that originated from the impact of World War II and was reinforced by the pacifist trend during the 1960s. Former Soviet Foreign Minister Anton Krylenko, for example, privately called Khrushchev and his advisors the Martians for their ignorance of the laws of power politics. I wonder how puzzled must be the US and other NATO countries, he confessed to his son. It's a mystery for them why Khrushchev and his friends in Politburo cannot comprehend how to use force and pressure for defending their state interests. Kukovic personified the reluctance to use of force. Indeed, for him, it was less of a lesson from experience than a fundamental part of his character. The principle of nonviolence was a sincere belief with Khrushchev, not merely the foundation of his domestic and foreign policy, but one of his personal codes. His colleagues and assistants confirmed that the avoidance of bloodshed was a constant concern of Khrushchev, and that for Khrushchev, an unwillingness to shed blood was not only a criterion but a condition of his involvement in politics. Khrushchev, they observed, by character was a man incapable not only of using dictatorial measures, but even for resorting to hardline administrative means. The critics claimed that Khrushchev had no guts for blood, even when it was dictated by state interests. As a result, Khrushchev simply let the communist regime in Eastern Europe slip away with no intention of intervening. Without Khrushchev and his personal idiosyncrasies, the rapid disintegration of the Soviet Union itself would not have occurred. At each stage of the Soviet endgame, Khrushchev made choices to destabilize the USSR and snap it straight to act coherently as a superpower. The loss of American partner in continuity left in the position of a sole superpower, a ultrapower or hyperpower. But as the United States learned the hard way, it also left the world in many ways less governable. Kolko noted the subsequent disorder in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union itself, following the loss of the USSR as a stabilizing force. The breakdown of the Cold War tension, as Undersecretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger confessed at the end of 1991, meant also loosening the control of international system over the behavior of its constituent members. The US ultimately had to concede that the Soviet Union's stability role since 1945 had been vital to its interests, though none of its analysis ever adequately appreciated the magnitude of contribution to curbing the left since 1944 for such insight who had destroyed the very foundation of their worldview. In case of the new status quo in Eastern Europe and the former USSR itself, the enormous peril of civil wars and bloody conflicts between new and independent states, which the highest American officials had feared, began to be fulfilled immediately. For the first time since 1944, parts of Europe were again at war. Hobsbawm likewise argued that suddenly removed the props which had held up the international structure and, to the extent not yet appreciated, the structure of the world's domestic political system. What was left was the world in disarray and partial collapse, because there was nothing to replace them. The idea, briefly entertained by American spokesmen, that the old bipolar order could have been replaced by a new world order based on the single superpower which remained in vain, and therefore looked stronger than ever, rapidly proved unrealistic. The collapse of the communist regime between Istria and Vladivostok not only produced an enormous zone of political uncertainty, instability, chaos, and civil war, but also destroyed the international system that had stabilized international relations for some 40 years. It also revealed the precariousness of the domestic political system that has essentially rested on that stability. The basic unit of political politics themselves, the territorial, the sovereign, and independent nation states, include the oldest and stablest, found themselves pulled apart by the forces of supranational or transnational economy and by infranational forces of secessionist regions or ethnic groups. As true as far as it goes, the collapse of the USSR and the Soviet bloc ended the constraint result from their rivalry and from the need to avoid direct superpower conflict. On the other hand, it eliminated the Soviet role in restraining revolutionary forces, a role which had been dispensable to the United States' control over its own sphere of influence. After a period of unpopularity in the 1990s and 2000s, the world shifted to a hybrid or transitional state between unipolar and multipolar order. There was a single global superpower by default, but it was discovered unexpected limits in Iraq and Afghanistan, and confronting Russia and China as a rising regional power. And people thought that after 1991 there would be no more revolutions. In 1994, anarchism has returned, with the Zapatista revolution establishing a successful anarchist society based on the principles and practice on mutualism and collectivism, and Rojava were more in line with anarchist communism. It shows you that without Soviet influence, revolutions are possible. It only takes China, who is becoming more of a libertarian capitalist element, came in, that's just like the United States. It's only the worst case scenario that anarcho capitalist, you know, anarcho fascist, I hate that term, it becomes the dominant position among already existing superpowers.